Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the world's quieter questions get the time they deserve, and the places most people only half understand are allowed to unfold at their own pace, slowly, carefully, and without rushing toward a conclusion. Tonight, we're going somewhere vast, somewhere that sits in the middle of some of the most complicated geography on the planet, and carries more history, more tension, and more at stake than almost any other body of water on Earth. We're going to the South China Sea. If you've heard the name before, you have probably heard it attached to headlines. Territorial disputes, naval standoffs, diplomatic warnings, and those headlines are real, and we will get to them. But before any of that, I want to take a moment to simply describe this place. Because the South China Sea is not just a political problem, it is a place. A physical, living, ancient, layered place that existed long before anyone drew a line across it, and that will exist long after the current arguments have been replaced by whatever comes next. And to understand why it matters so much, you have to understand what it actually is. The South China Sea covers approximately 3.5 million square kilometres. That is roughly the size of the entire Mediterranean Sea, and then some, or, if you prefer, larger than the combined landmass of India and Pakistan. It stretches from the southern coast of China in the north all the way down toward the Indonesian archipelago in the south, and from the eastern coast of Vietnam westward to the Philippine Islands. The countries that border it read like a list of some of the most dynamic, complicated and historically rich nations in the world. China to the north, Vietnam along the western edge, Malaysia and Brunei to the south, Indonesia, whose enormous archipelago forms the sea's southern boundary, the Philippines to the east, and Taiwan, which sits at the northeastern corner and whose relationship with the sea is its own separate layer of complexity. Every one of these places has a claim on this water. Some of those claims overlap, some of them contradict each other entirely, and none of them are simple. The sea is not uniform in depth. Near the coastlines, particularly along the shallow Sunda Shelf in the south and southwest, the water can be only a few dozen meters deep, warm and calm, almost gentle in the way it sits. But toward the center and northeast, the floor drops away dramatically. The deepest point in the South China Sea is the West Philippine Deep, which reaches approximately 5,559 meters below the surface. That is more than 5.5 kilometers of open water, dark and cold and pressing. It is a reminder that beneath the political arguments about reefs and islands and fishing rights, there is an actual ocean here, with all the weight and silence that implies. Scattered across this enormous body of water are more than 250 small islands, reefs, atolls and shoals. Most of them are tiny. Many of them are barely above sea level. Some of them disappear entirely at high tide, technically qualifying as what international law calls submerged features rather than islands. But these small, often unremarkable pieces of rock and sand have become some of the most contested real estate on the planet. Because in the logic of modern international maritime law, a habitable island can generate an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles in every direction. And in a sea this size, surrounded by this many competing nations, those invisible circles of legal jurisdiction overlap each other constantly, like ripples in a pond where too many stones have been thrown at once. Then there is the trade. The South China Sea carries roughly 1/3 of the world's maritime trade every year. Estimates put the value of goods passing through it at around $3.4 trillion annually. Container ships, oil tankers, cargo vessels of every size move through its lanes in a constant quiet parade. The Strait of Malacca, which connects the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean at its southwestern corner, is one of the busiest and most strategically critical shipping choke points in the world. If that flow were ever seriously disrupted, the effects would be felt from Tokyo to Rotterdam to Los Angeles within weeks. Fuel prices, consumer goods, raw materials, electronics. The sea does not just matter to the countries that border it, it matters to almost everyone. And before we go any further, I want to pause here and ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere in Asia, perhaps close to this sea yourself, in a city that has grown up in its shadow? Or are you on the other side of the world entirely, somewhere in Europe or North America or South America, where the South China Sea might feel abstract, a name you have heard on the news but never quite pictured? Whatever your answer, I think by the end of tonight you will feel this place a little more concretely than you did before. And what time is it where you are? Late at night perhaps, with the kind of quiet that makes a long story feel like exactly the right thing? I hope so. That is the kind of listening I had in mind. If you are enjoying this kind of slow, careful exploration, I would be genuinely grateful if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It is a small thing, but it makes a real difference in helping this channel reach other people who appreciate this kind of storytelling. A quiet corner of the internet that takes its time. Now, let us keep going. The South China Sea is, in a word, layered. Every layer you pull back reveals another one underneath. The political layer is what most people encounter first, and it is genuinely complicated. But beneath it is a historical layer that stretches back thousands of years, and beneath that is a geological layer that goes back tens of millions of years, and beneath all of it is an ecological layer of extraordinary richness that is, quietly and somewhat urgently, being destroyed. All of these layers interact with each other. The geology shaped what resources exist here. The resources drove the history. The history produced the competing claims. The competing claims created the political crisis, and the political crisis is now accelerating the ecological damage. It is a chain of causes and consequences that is worth following carefully, because none of it makes full sense without the others. But let us start with the most basic thing: the sea itself, the physical fact of it. When you look at a map of the South China Sea, the first thing that strikes you is its shape. It is roughly oval, slightly elongated from northeast to southwest, enclosed on most sides by land but open at its northern end through the Taiwan Strait and at its southern end toward the Java Sea and the broader Pacific. It is not a closed sea in the way the Mediterranean is. Water moves through it, in and out, driven by monsoon winds that reverse direction seasonally, pushing surface currents north in one half of the year and south in the other. These seasonal reversals have shaped human movement across this sea for thousands of years. Sailors in ancient times understood the monsoon rhythms the way modern pilots understand weather systems. You waited for the right wind, you sailed, you waited again, you returned. The sea itself set the schedule. The monsoon winds also bring rain, enormous amounts of it. The South China Sea sits in one of the most rainfall-heavy regions on Earth, and its warm surface water, heated by tropical sun year-round, is the engine behind some of the most powerful storms on the planet. Typhoons form over this sea, intensify over its warmth, and then track northward or westward, sometimes reaching the Philippines, Vietnam, or southern China with devastating force. This is not a minor detail. It is part of the character of the place. The sea is not just contested, it is also genuinely, physically dangerous, in ways that have nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the basic physics of warm water and rotating air. There are the islands too, or what pass for islands. The two main clusters are the Paracel Islands in the northern part of the sea, roughly halfway between Vietnam and the Philippines, and the Spratly Islands in the south, a sprawling scatter of reefs, shoals, and tiny land features spread across an area of roughly 425,000 square kilometres. The Spratlys in particular are extraordinary in their complexity. There are somewhere between 100 and 750 individual features depending on how you count them, and many of them sit barely above the waterline, surrounded by shallow reef systems that can wreck a ship that does not know exactly where it is. Navigating through the Spratlys without detailed charts is genuinely dangerous. Sailors have known this for centuries, and there is a region within them still called the Dangerous Ground, a name that appears on nautical charts and says exactly what it means. What is striking about all of this, when you take a step back, is that the South China Sea is simultaneously one of the most important bodies of water in the world and one of the most physically challenging to use. It is rich in resources, critical to global trade, biologically extraordinary, and also typhoon-prone, reef-hazardous, and politically explosive. It has always attracted human attention, and it has always pushed back. There is something almost fitting about that. The more valuable a place is, the harder it seems to be to actually hold it. And it has been contested for a very long time, not just in the modern era of satellite imagery and international tribunals, but for centuries, perhaps millennia, in the quieter ways that humans have always contested useful places. Fishing communities, trading routes, colonial ambitions, imperial maps. The South China Sea has been argued over in every era of human history that left records, and probably in eras that did not. The arguments have changed shape depending on who was doing the arguing and what tools they had available, but the underlying logic has always been roughly the same. This sea matters. It produces food. It enables trade. It connects places. Whoever controls it, or even claims to control it, has something real. That is the tension we're going to follow tonight, not just the modern geopolitical version of it, though we will spend considerable time there, but the full arc of it, from the geology that shaped this sea's physical character, through the ancient and colonial histories that produced today's competing claims, through the legal frameworks that were supposed to resolve things and largely failed, through the military build-ups and the ecological damage and the quiet human cost that ordinary fishermen and sailors pay every day, and finally, to where things stand now and what might happen next. This is a story about a sea, but it is also a story about what happens when too many powerful interests converge on a single place, and none of them are willing to move. It is a story about the distance between what international law says and what actually happens on the water. It is a story about fish and oil and coral reefs and old maps and aircraft carriers and men in small wooden boats who just want to go home with enough catch to feed their families. It is a story about how a body of water can become, in the same moment, a trade highway, a military theatre, a legal battleground, and a disappearing ecosystem. The South China Sea is all of those things at once. And to understand how it got there, we need to start at the very beginning. Not with the politics, not with the treaties, not even with the history of human settlement. We need to start with the seafloor itself, and the geological forces that shape this basin over tens of millions of years, because those forces are not as distant from the present conflict as they might seem. The physical structure of this sea, its shallow shelves and deep basins, its scattered reefs and submerged ridges, created the very conditions that concentrated resources here in the first place. And it is the resources, more than anything else, that explain why so many nations have been willing to argue so hard for so long over water. To understand the South China Sea as it exists today, you have to go back roughly 32 million years. That is when the basin began to take its current shape, pulled apart by geological forces operating on a scale so vast and so slow that the entire recorded history of human civilization fits inside a single rounding error at the end of the calculation. The process is called seafloor spreading, and it is essentially what it sounds like. The Earth's crust, which is not a single solid shell but a collection of moving plates, pulled apart here in the late Eocene and early Oligocene epochs, opening a rift between what is now southern China and the land masses to the south. As the plates separated, new oceanic crust formed along the spreading centre, and the basin deepened and widened over millions of years into something resembling the sea we know today. The spreading eventually slowed and stopped, sometime around 15 to 17 million years ago. But by then the basic architecture of the South China Sea had been established, a deep central basin reaching down more than 5,000 metres in places, and surrounding that deep basin, a broad, shallow continental shelf called the Sunda Shelf, one of the largest in the world, the The Sunda Shelf is enormous. It underlies much of what is now the shallow water between the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Sumatra, and the southern edge of the South China Sea. And during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower, much of it was dry land. The islands of Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and the Malay Peninsula were all connected by a broad flat plain that geologists call Sundaland. People walked across it. Animals migrated across it. Rivers ran across it into what is now open ocean. It is one of the stranger facts about this region that some of the seafloor beneath the South China Sea was, not so very long ago in geological terms, a landscape where ancient humans may have lived and hunted. The Sunda Shelf is relevant to the modern dispute in a very direct way. It is shallow, often less than 200 metres deep, and in some areas much shallower than that. The Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, the Reed Bank, the Macclesfield Bank, and the various reefs and shoals scattered across the sea all rise from this shelf or from submerged ridges associated with it. They are not isolated volcanic peaks erupting from the deep ocean floor. They are the high points of a drowned continental platform, places where the shelf comes close enough to the surface to break the waterline, or nearly break it. That distinction matters because it affects how these features are classified under international law, and how they are classified determines what kind of maritime rights they generate. But we will come to that. For now, the important thing is that the Sunda Shelf created a vast, shallow, sunlit underwater plain, and shallow, sunlit water is enormously productive. It supports coral reefs, it supports fish nurseries, it supports the kind of biological abundance that has drawn human fishing communities to this region for thousands of years. The deeper parts of the sea are a different story entirely. The central basin drops sharply below the shelf edge, and in the northeast, near the Philippines, the West Philippine Deep reaches around 5,559 metres. That is nearly 3.5 miles of water. The transition from shallow shelf to deep basin is not gradual in all places. In some areas the shelf edge is quite abrupt, which creates navigation hazards and also generates unusual current patterns as water moves between different depth zones. The Luzon Strait, which connects the South China Sea to the Pacific Ocean in the northeast, is one of the deepest and most energetically complex passages in the region. Water flows through it in both directions depending on conditions, and it plays an important role in the sea's overall circulation. Oceanographers have studied it extensively because understanding how the South China Sea exchanges water with the Pacific affects everything from typhoon intensity to the behaviour of fish populations. The seafloor itself is not uniform in the way that a simple map might suggest. There are submerged ridges running in various directions, remnants of ancient tectonic activity. There are deep sedimentary basins where organic material has accumulated over millions of years, compressed by heat and pressure into the hydrocarbons that would eventually become the centre of the modern resource dispute. There are also areas of the sea floor where the geology is poorly understood simply because the water is deep, the conditions are difficult, and the political complexity of the region has made systematic scientific survey difficult to organise. Some of what lies beneath this sea is still genuinely unknown. One of the most distinctive features of the South China Sea's physical geography is what sailors have called the dangerous ground for centuries. This is a region in the southern Spratlys, roughly between the coasts of Borneo and the Philippines, where the shelf is extremely shallow and covered with a dense, chaotic scatter of reefs, shoals, and low-lying features. Some of these reefs are submerged at all times and invisible from the surface. Others appear and disappear with the tide. Many are unmarked on older charts or marked only approximately. The density of hazards in this region is extraordinary, even by the standards of a sea that is already full of them. Modern vessels with GPS and detailed electronic charts can navigate it carefully, but even today a ship that loses its positioning system or strays off course in this area is in genuine danger. Before modern navigation, it was simply a place where ships disappeared. Sailors knew it was there, knew roughly where it was, and tried to avoid it. Those who could not avoid it, or who misjudged its location, often did not return. The tectonic history of the sea also connects to its seismic and volcanic activity, though the South China Sea is not as dramatically volcanic as some other parts of Southeast Asia. The region sits near the intersection of several major tectonic plates, and earthquakes are not uncommon. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which originated further west in the Andaman Sea, was a reminder of how geologically active this broader region is. The South China Sea itself has experienced significant seismic events, and the subduction zones at its eastern and southern margins, where the Philippine Sea Plate and the Australian Plate interact with the Eurasian Plate, remain geologically active. This is not an abstract concern. Submarine earthquakes can generate tsunamis, and the shallow shelf areas of the South China Sea would funnel and amplify tsunami waves in ways that could be catastrophic for coastal communities in Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and southern China. Then there is the matter of typhoons. The South China Sea's warm, shallow water is essentially a fuel source for tropical cyclones. Water temperature is the primary driver of typhoon intensity, and the sea's surface temperatures remain high year-round, typically between 28 and 30 degrees Celsius across much of its area. When a low-pressure system moves over this warm water, it can intensify rapidly, drawing up heat and moisture and organising into the rotating spiral structure of a typhoon. The sea does not generate all of its typhoons internally. Many form over the western Pacific and then move into the South China Sea through the Luzon Strait or across the Philippines. But the sea's warmth sustains them, and in some cases intensifies them further as they track toward land. The statistics here are not abstract. The Western Pacific and South China Sea region generates more tropical cyclones than any other ocean basin on Earth. On average, somewhere between 25 and 30 named storms form in this region each year, and a significant number of them pass over or through the South China Sea. Typhoon Haiyan in November 2013 is the most well-known recent example. It formed over the Western Pacific, crossed the Philippines at catastrophic intensity, and tracked into the South China Sea before making additional landfalls in Vietnam. At its peak, Haiyan produced sustained winds of around 315 kilometers per hour, making it one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded at landfall. More than 6,300 people were killed, the majority in the Philippines. The storm surge into Tacloban reached as high as 7 meters in some areas. It was a demonstration of what the physical environment of this region is capable of producing, independent of any human decision or political calculation. What the geology and climate of the South China Sea created, over tens of millions of years, was a set of physical conditions that concentrated value in a relatively small area. The shallow shelf produced rich fisheries. The deep sedimentary basins accumulated hydrocarbons. The warm water and abundant sunlight supported some of the most biodiverse coral reef systems on Earth. The monsoon winds made the sea navigable in predictable seasonal patterns, enabling the development of ancient trade routes, and the scattered islands and reefs, rising from the shelf in a wide arc across the central and southern sea, provided the only dry land, or near dry land, for hundreds of miles in any direction. In a region where maritime trade was the economic backbone of entire civilizations, those tiny features mattered enormously, as waypoints, as shelters, as sources of fresh water, as fishing grounds, as places to wait out bad weather. The reed bank sitting northeast of Borneo and partially submerged is now understood to sit above one of the more significant potential hydrocarbon accumulations in the South China Sea. It is within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone under the rules of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it has been the subject of ongoing tension between China and the Philippines for years. But the reason it matters at all, the reason anyone is arguing about a shallow submerged bank in the middle of the sea, goes back to geology. The organic sediments that accumulated on that shelf over millions of years, compressed and transformed by heat and pressure, are the reason the reed bank has any geopolitical significance whatsoever. The argument is ultimately about ancient biology, converted by time into oil and gas, sitting beneath water that two governments claim as their own. There is something worth sitting with in that. The features at the centre of one of the world's most complex and dangerous territorial disputes are, geologically speaking, the remnants of a drowned landscape. They are the high points of a continental shelf that was once dry land, surrounded by what was once a smaller and shallower sea. The oil and gas beneath them formed from the remains of organisms that lived and died long before there were human beings to argue about anything. The reefs themselves are built from coral polyps, whose ancestors were constructing calcium carbonate structures in these waters for millions of years before the first fishing boat crossed this sea. The resources that nations are willing to use military force to control are, at their origin, entirely indifferent to human ownership. That indifference is part of what makes the South China Sea so difficult to resolve. The geology does not care about the 9-dash line. The typhoons do not respect exclusive economic zones. The fish do not swim in patterns that correspond to any nation's maritime boundary. The sea was shaped by forces operating on timescales that make the entire history of human civilization look brief, and the resources it concentrated were placed there by processes that had nothing to do with any of the nations now claiming them. But nations are not indifferent, and the resources are real, and the geography is fixed, and so the arguments continue. The geological structure of the sea also created something else, something that would become central to the modern conflict in a way that the ancient tectonic forces could not have anticipated. It created the conditions for sedimentary hydrocarbon accumulation, and when the 20th century arrived with its appetite for oil and gas, the South China Sea suddenly became not just a fishing ground and a trade route, but a potential energy reserve sitting beneath some of the most contested water on Earth. The estimates vary, and they have been debated extensively, but the numbers that have shaped policy decisions are significant. And understanding what those numbers mean, and why they became the engine of modern territorial conflict, requires looking at the sea not just as a geological feature, but as an economic one. The numbers that circulate most often in discussions about the South China Sea's energy resources come from a 2013 assessment by the United States Energy Information Administration. That assessment estimated the sea holds approximately 11 billion barrels of oil and around 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in proved and probable reserves. Those are the conservative figures, the ones drawn from what has actually been measured and confirmed through exploration. Other estimates, including some produced by Chinese state energy agencies, have placed the potential undiscovered resources considerably higher, with figures sometimes cited in the range of 125 billion barrels of oil. The gap between those two sets of numbers is enormous, and that gap matters, because a significant portion of the political urgency surrounding the South China Sea has been built on the higher projections. When governments and analysts argue that the sea is worth fighting over, they're often drawing on estimates that have not been verified by actual drilling, estimates that may reflect geological optimism as much as geological evidence. The US EIA assessment was deliberately conservative for that reason. It only counted what exploration had actually found. But even the conservative numbers are substantial. 11 billion barrels of oil is roughly comparable to Mexico's total proved reserves. 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas is a significant figure by any regional standard. And the Spratly Islands, that scattered archipelago of reefs, shoals and low-lying features spread across the southern part of the sea, are believed to sit above a portion of those reserves that has never been fully characterized, in part because the political situation makes large-scale exploration extremely difficult. The Reed Bank, which sits in shallower water northeast of Borneo, has been identified as a particularly promising area. The Vanguard Bank, off the southern coast of Vietnam, has already been partially explored. Vietnamese state energy company PetroVietnam has drilled in nearby waters and found commercially viable reserves. The basic geology is not in dispute. The sedimentary basins are real, the hydrocarbons are there in some quantity, and the question of exactly how much remains genuinely open. What transformed these geological facts into a political crisis was timing. Most of the serious exploration and resource assessment in the South China Sea happened in the second half of the 20th century, precisely when the nations bordering the sea were also establishing themselves as independent states, with their own economic ambitions and their own interpretations of where their maritime boundaries should lie. Vietnam was reunified in 1975 and immediately began asserting its own claims. The Philippines had been independent since 1946 and had its own understanding of what waters fell within its jurisdiction. Malaysia became independent in 1957 and developed its own offshore energy industry. China, having emerged from decades of civil war and political upheaval, was by the 1970s starting to look outward again, and the South China Sea was part of what it saw. All of these nations needed energy. All of them were looking at the same body of water and arriving at different conclusions about who had the right to what lay beneath it. The fish, though, came before the oil in terms of human history, and in some ways they remain the more immediately important resource for the people who actually live along the sea's edges. The South China Sea provides somewhere between 10 and 12% of the global fish catch, depending on how the boundaries are drawn and how the calculations are made. That is a remarkable fraction of the world's total marine harvest coming from a single body of water. For the coastal communities of Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and southern China, the sea is not an abstract geopolitical asset. It is the source of daily protein, of livelihoods, of generational identity. Fishing families in central Vietnam have worked these waters for centuries. Communities in the Philippine Visayas have built their entire economic and cultural lives around access to the reefs and shoals of the Western Sea. For these people, the fish are not a footnote to the oil and gas story. They are the whole story. And the fish story has been getting worse for a long time. Scientific assessments of fish stock levels in the South China Sea paint a picture that is genuinely alarming. Some studies have estimated that fish populations in the sea have declined by between 70 and 95% since the 1950s, depending on the species and the specific area being measured. Demersal fish, the species that live near the seafloor, including grouper, snapper, and various reef fish, have been particularly hard hit. The reef ecosystems that support these species have been degraded by a combination of overfishing, destructive fishing practices, coastal development, and more recently by the physical destruction caused by island construction activities. A 2016 study estimated that the overall fish biomass in the South China Sea had fallen to a fraction of its mid-20th century level. The causes are multiple, and they compound each other. Industrial fishing fleets from China, Vietnam, Thailand, and other nations have dramatically expanded their capacity since the 1970s. Technological improvements in navigation, sonar, and net design have made it possible to find and catch fish more efficiently than at any previous point in history. The result has been a sustained and accelerating drawdown of stocks that cannot reproduce fast enough to keep pace with the harvest. The problem is not unique to the South China Sea, it is a global story. But in this particular sea, the combination of high fishing pressure, reef destruction, and the political impossibility of agreeing on any coordinated management regime has made the decline especially severe. Destructive fishing practices have made it worse. Dynamite fishing, which involves detonating explosives underwater to stun or kill fish, has been documented across the region for decades. It is illegal in every country that borders the sea, but enforcement is inconsistent and in some remote reef areas essentially non-existent. Cyanide fishing, which involves squirting sodium cyanide solution onto reefs to stun fish for live capture, has also been widespread, particularly in areas supplying the live reef fish trade to restaurants in Hong Kong, mainland China, and other markets. Cyanide kills coral and other marine organisms while leaving the target fish temporarily alive. The practice is illegal, but the economic incentives are strong and the monitoring is weak. The connection between fish depletion and the escalating confrontations at sea is more direct than it might appear at first glance. As fish stocks have declined in coastal waters and in the areas that fall clearly within one nation's jurisdiction, fishing fleets have been pushed further offshore into disputed waters to find viable catches. Vietnamese fishermen who once worked closer to their own coast have been compelled by declining local stocks to fish in areas near the Paracel Islands, the Spratlys and Scarborough Shoal, where they encounter Chinese Coast Guard vessels. Filipino fishermen at Scarborough Shoal, which lies well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, have faced systematic exclusion since 2012. The depletion of the resource has increased the pressure on the most contested areas, which has increased the frequency of confrontations, which has increased the political tension, which has made any cooperative management of the remaining stocks even less likely. It is a reinforcing cycle, and it has been running for decades. There is a particular irony embedded in all of this that becomes more apparent the longer you look at it. The territorial disputes in the South China Sea are, at their stated core, about securing access to resources: oil, gas, fish. Nations are claiming islands and reefs and building military installations because they want to control the economic value that lies beneath and around those features. But the process of disputing and militarizing the sea has itself contributed to the destruction of the very resources being fought over. The dredging operations that China used to build its artificial islands in the Spratlys caused massive and well-documented damage to coral reef ecosystems. The exclusion of fishermen from traditional grounds has disrupted the informal, community-based conservation practices that once provided some limit on overfishing. The political impossibility of joint management has prevented any coordinated response to the fish stock collapse. The nations are fighting over a diminishing prize, and the fighting is part of what is diminishing it. The oil and gas picture is complicated by a related problem, which is that extracting the resources under the disputed areas requires a level of political stability and legal clarity that the South China Sea simply does not have. Offshore oil and gas development requires enormous capital investment, long planning horizons, and confidence that a company will be able to operate without interference and keep whatever it extracts. None of those conditions are reliably present in the most disputed parts of the sea. Vietnam has been able to develop some of its offshore fields in the southern part of its exclusive economic zone, but Chinese vessels have harassed Vietnamese drilling operations on multiple occasions. In 2019, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and survey ship spent months operating near a Vietnamese drilling block in waters that Vietnam considers its own, effectively disrupting exploration activity. The Philippines has struggled to attract investment for its offshore blocks in the West Philippine Sea, in part because the political risk is too high for many companies. The result is something like a standoff over a treasure chest that nobody can fully open. The resources are real, or at least plausibly real in sufficient quantity to matter. The nations surrounding the sea need them. But the dispute itself has made systematic development difficult, and the environmental degradation caused by the dispute has been reducing the biological resources that are already being harvested. The sea is caught in a kind of resource paradox, where the desire to control the wealth has undermined the ability to benefit from it. China's approach to this paradox has been notably different from that of the other claimants. Rather than waiting for legal clarity or attempting to negotiate shared development arrangements, China has proceeded with a strategy of establishing physical presence and effective control over as much of the sea as possible, and then managing the resource question from a position of dominance. The island building program that began in earnest around 2013 and 2014 was not primarily about the oil and gas directly beneath the artificial islands themselves. It was about establishing the infrastructure, the military presence, and the administrative reality that would allow China to control access to the broader sea and its resources on its own terms. The fish and the hydrocarbons are the underlying motivation. The islands are the instrument. For the smaller claimants, the resource question has a different texture. Vietnam, the Philippines and Malaysia all need the energy resources in their respective parts of the sea for genuine economic reasons, not just strategic ones. Vietnam's offshore oil production has been a significant contributor to its national revenue. Malaysia's state energy company Petronas operates fields in waters that overlap with Chinese claims. The Philippines has untapped potential in the Malampaya gas field area and in the waters around the Sprat List that could be meaningful for its energy security. These are not abstract geopolitical prizes. They are resources that would make a real difference to national economies that are still developing. The fish matter in a more immediate human way. When a Vietnamese fisherman is detained by Chinese Coast Guard vessels near the Paracels, it is not a diplomatic incident in the abstract. It is a man who cannot pay his debts, a family that does not eat well that week, a community that is slowly losing its economic foundation. The fisheries of the South China Sea are not just a percentage of global catch on a spreadsheet. They are the livelihood of millions of people living in coastal communities from the Gulf of Tonkin to the Sulu Sea. When the fish decline, those people feel it directly. When access to traditional fishing grounds is blocked, the effect is immediate and personal in a way that oil revenue projections simply are not. Understanding the resource dimension of the South China Sea dispute means holding both of those things at once. The high-level strategic calculation about energy reserves and maritime dominance, and the ground-level reality of fishing families, declining catches, and blocked access to waters their grandparents worked without interference. The oil and gas are what drive the geopolitical competition at the level of governments and military planners. The fish are what connect the dispute to the daily lives of ordinary people who have no particular interest in great power competition and would simply like to be able to fish. Both of these resource stories, the hydrocarbons and the fisheries, exist within a legal framework that was supposed to provide a basis for resolving exactly these kinds of overlapping claims. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which came into force in 1994, established rules about who has the right to what resources and how far those rights extend from a nation's coast. It was designed precisely for situations like the South China Sea, where multiple nations border the same body of water and where the question of who owns what beneath the surface needs some kind of agreed answer. But to understand why that legal framework has not resolved anything, and in some ways has made the situation more volatile rather than less, you have to go back much further than the 1980s when the convention was being negotiated. You have to go back to the histories that each nation brings to this sea, histories that are centuries old, deeply felt, and in fundamental conflict with each other. The histories that people bring to the South China Sea are not simple. They are not the kind of histories where one side has a clear and ancient title, and the other side arrived later with a competing claim. Every nation that borders this sea has a version of the past that is genuinely old, genuinely documented in some form, and genuinely incompatible with the versions held by its neighbours. That is not an accident. It is a reflection of how the sea was actually used for centuries by many different peoples at different times and in different ways, none of whom were thinking about the legal frameworks that would eventually be applied to their movements. Chinese records describing the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands go back a very long time. Some scholars point to texts from the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, that describe islands in the Southern Sea. Later records from the Tang and Song dynasties describe Chinese fishermen operating in these waters, and there are references to what appear to be the Paracels in texts from the Ming Dynasty period as well. The Qing dynasty produced maps that included the islands, and Chinese fishermen from Hainan Island maintained seasonal camps on some of the Paracels for generations, fishing the reefs and sheltering from storms. These are real historical connections. They are not invented. The difficulty is that they do not look much like sovereignty in the modern legal sense. They look like use, which is a different thing. Vietnam's historical relationship with the sea is also long and well documented. Vietnamese fishing communities from the central coast have been working the waters around the Paracel Islands for centuries, and there are records from the Nguyen lords and later the Nguyen dynasty showing that Vietnamese authorities administered the Paracels and collected taxes from people operating there. A Vietnamese document from the early 19th century describes the dispatch of an official expedition to the Paracels to survey the islands, collect goods, and erect markers. The Vietnamese government has preserved and publicised these documents carefully, and historians who have examined them generally agree that they represent genuine administrative activity, not just occasional fishing visits. Vietnam's claim to the Paracels is not a modern invention. It rests on a documented history of presence and administration that predates the current dispute by a very long time. The Philippines approaches the question from a different angle. The Philippine archipelago was defined as a colonial entity by Spain and then transferred to the United States through the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. That treaty drew a specific boundary around the Philippines using lines of longitude and latitude, and the Spratly Islands lie outside that boundary. This is a point that China and other claimants have raised to argue that the Philippines has no historical basis for its claims in the Spratlys. The Philippine counter-argument is more recent in origin. In 1956, a Filipino explorer and businessman named Thomas Clomer sailed to a group of islands and reefs in the Spratlys and declared them a new territory he called Freedom Land, claiming they were terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. The Philippine government eventually took formal possession of several features in the Spratlys in the 1970s, and the Philippines has occupied a number of them ever since. The historical depth of the Philippine claim is shallower than China's or Vietnam's, but the Philippines argues that its claim is based on proximity, on the fact that the features in question sit within what would be its exclusive economic zone under modern international law, and on the principle that features which were genuinely unoccupied and uncontrolled cannot simply be claimed retrospectively by anyone who has old maps. Malaysia's claim is the most recent in terms of its formal articulation. Malaysia only became an independent nation in 1963, and it did not assert claims to any features in the Spratlys until 1979, when it published a map showing a continental shelf boundary that included several reefs. Malaysia's claim is essentially geographic and geological, resting on the argument that certain features in the southern Spratlys sit on its continental shelf and therefore fall within its jurisdiction under the emerging framework of international maritime law. There are no ancient Malaysian texts describing administration of these reefs. The claim is modern and deliberate, and Malaysia has been relatively quiet about it diplomatically compared to China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, but it has backed it up with physical presence. Malaysian forces have occupied Swallow Reef since 1983. Brunei claims a small area of sea based on its continental shelf and exclusive economic zone, overlapping with parts of the Spratlys, though it occupies no features and has been the most restrained of all the claimants in its public posture. Taiwan, for its part, holds the largest natural island in the Spratlys, called Itu Aba by the Philippines and Taiping Island by Taiwan and China. Taiwan has occupied it since 1956 and maintains a Coast Guard presence there. The complexity of Taiwan's position is layered, because Taiwan's government was the one that originally drew the 11-dash line in 1947, the predecessor to China's current 9-dash line, and the two governments share a broadly similar historical narrative about Chinese sovereignty in the South China Sea, even though they are political rivals in every other respect. The 11-dash line, which became the 9-dash line after 2 dashes were removed in the 1950s, is worth pausing on for a moment because it is the document that underlies the entire modern Chinese claim, and its origins reveal something important about how the current situation developed. In 1947, the Republic of China government, which was then governing mainland China before losing the civil war to the communists in 1949, published a map of the South China Sea with a series of dashes arranged in a U-shape around the bulk of the sea. The dashes enclosed the Paracels, the Spratlys, the Pratas Islands and Macclesfield Bank, effectively claiming the vast majority of the sea's area. The map was produced by a government bureau and circulated officially, but it was never accompanied by a formal legal declaration explaining what exactly the dashes meant. Did they claim sovereignty over the islands only, or over the water and seabed within the line as well? The original drafters did not specify clearly, and that ambiguity has been argued about ever since. When the People's Republic of China inherited the map and eventually reduced the dashes from 11 to 9, it also inherited the ambiguity. The 9-dash line became the central symbol of China's position in the South China Sea without anyone ever having fully defined what it actually claimed. The Japanese occupation of the South China Sea during the Second World War adds another layer of complexity to the historical picture. Japan seized the Spratly Islands in 1939, administering them as part of its empire and using them as a submarine base and staging area during the war. Japan also occupied the Paracels and used the South China Sea as a critical maritime corridor for its operations throughout Southeast Asia. When Japan was defeated in 1945, the question of what happened to the territories it had occupied became urgent, and the answer was not as clean as one might hope. The 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, which formally ended the war in the Pacific, required Japan to renounce all claims to the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. But the treaty did not specify who those islands should go to. The drafters of the treaty made a deliberate decision not to assign sovereignty, partly because the political situation in China was complicated by the Civil War and the question of which Chinese government to recognise, and partly because the claimants could not agree. The result was that Japan gave up the islands, but nobody was formally given them. The legal vacuum created in 1951 is one that has never been filled, and every claimant has been trying to fill it with its own history ever since. What makes this historical contest so genuinely difficult is that none of the claims are entirely baseless. Chinese fishermen really did work these waters for centuries. Vietnamese authorities really did administer the Paracels in the 19th century. The 1898 Treaty of Paris really did draw a boundary that excluded the Spratlys from the Philippines. Japan really did occupy the islands, and really did renounce them without assigning them to anyone. Each of these facts is real. Each of them supports a different conclusion. And the problem with historical claims to maritime territory is that history was not made with modern legal categories in mind. The people fishing the Paracels in the 16th century were not thinking about exclusive economic zones or continental shelf rights. The Vietnamese officials who sent expeditions to the Paracels in the early 19th century were not thinking about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They were doing what people did in their time and place, and the meaning we assign to their actions now is shaped by legal frameworks that did not exist when those actions were taken. There is also the uncomfortable reality that maps lie, or at least that maps reflect political intentions as much as geographic facts. The Chinese 11-dash line map of 1947 was a political document produced by a government making a claim, not a neutral survey of historical reality. The Spanish colonial maps that defined the Philippine archipelago were produced by a colonial power for its own administrative purposes. The British Admiralty charts that named many of the features in the South China Sea during the 19th century reflected British navigational interests, not any view about sovereignty. Every map that gets cited in the South China Sea dispute was made by someone with a purpose, and that purpose was rarely to settle the question of who owned what. Vietnam and China have had direct confrontations over the historical question in ways that go beyond legal argument. In 1974, Chinese naval forces attacked the South Vietnamese garrison on the Paracel Islands, killing dozens of Vietnamese soldiers and seizing the entire island group. South Vietnam was at that point in the final stages of losing its war with North Vietnam, and no outside power intervened on its behalf. The Paracels have been under Chinese control ever since. In 1988, Chinese and Vietnamese naval forces clashed at Johnson South Reef in the Spratlys, in an engagement that left 64 Vietnamese sailors dead and 3 Vietnamese ships sunk. China occupied several reefs in the Spratlys as a result. These were not legal proceedings or diplomatic negotiations. They were the application of force to settle historical arguments, and force has a way of producing conclusions that historical documents cannot easily overturn. The Vietnamese government has been careful to document and preserve its historical evidence about the Paracels and Spratlys, and it has made those documents available to international scholars. It has also been consistent in its legal protests every time China has taken actions that Vietnam considers violations of its sovereignty. But Vietnam's position is complicated by the fact that there are documents from the 1950s in which North Vietnamese officials appeared to acknowledge Chinese sovereignty over the paracels, statements made during a period when Vietnam was dependent on Chinese support in its war with the United States. China has cited these statements as admissions. Vietnam argues they were made without legal authority and in a completely different political context. The dispute over what was said and what it meant is itself a kind of miniature version of the larger problem, where the same words can support opposite conclusions depending on how you read them and who is doing the reading. What emerges from all of this is not a history that anyone can use to simply win the argument. It is a history that is genuinely layered, genuinely contested, and genuinely unresolvable on its own terms. The historical records do not point to a single rightful owner of the South China Sea. They point to centuries of overlapping use, competing administration, colonial disruption, wartime seizure, and legal ambiguity. Every claimant can find something in the past to support its position, and every claimant can find something in the past that complicates it. This is precisely why the international community eventually turned to a legal framework rather than a historical one to try to manage these disputes. If history could not settle the question, perhaps modern law could. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which came into force in 1994 after years of negotiation, was designed to provide a systematic basis for resolving exactly these kinds of overlapping maritime claims. It established clear rules about how far a nation's maritime rights extended from its coast, what kind of features generated what kind of rights, and how disputes between neighbouring states should be resolved. It was, in principle, the instrument that was supposed to make the historical arguments less decisive by replacing them with a common set of rules that all signatories agreed to follow. But the modern legal framework did not resolve the South China Sea dispute. It sharpened it. It gave the claimants a new vocabulary for their arguments, a new set of legal concepts to fight over, and eventually a formal arbitration process whose outcome one of the most powerful parties simply refused to accept. The legal story of the South China Sea is in some ways more frustrating than the historical one, because it came so close to providing a clear answer, and then revealed exactly how little a clear answer matters when the party that loses it has enough power to ignore it. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is one of the more ambitious legal documents of the 20th century. It took 9 years to negotiate, ran to over 300 articles, and was signed in 1982 at a ceremony in Montego Bay, Jamaica. It came into force in 1994 after enough nations had ratified it, and by the time it was fully operational, it had more signatories than almost any other international treaty in existence. The people who built it were trying to solve a genuinely difficult problem, which is that the ocean does not come with fences. It does not respect administrative lines or colonial borders. It moves, it connects, it covers more than 2/3 of the planet, and for most of human history, nations simply claimed as much of it as they could defend. The convention was meant to change that. It was meant to replace the logic of power with the logic of rules. The core concept it introduced was the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Under UNCLOS, as the convention is commonly called, a coastal state has the right to explore, exploit and manage all natural resources within 200 nautical miles of its coastline. That includes fish, oil, gas, minerals, everything in the water, and on or beneath the seabed. Beyond 200 miles, the open ocean becomes international waters, where no single state has priority. The convention also defined the rules for the continental shelf, established rights for landlocked nations, and set up a system for resolving disputes between member states. It was careful, detailed, and comprehensive, and for most of the world's coastlines, it works reasonably well. The problem in the South China Sea is that 200 nautical miles from one country's coast overlap substantially with 200 nautical miles from another country's coast, because the sea is not large enough to give everyone a clean, non-overlapping zone. Vietnam's EEZ from its eastern coastline runs into the Paracel Islands, which China controls. The Philippines' EEZ from its western coastline extends well into the Spratly Islands, which are claimed by multiple parties. Malaysia's EEZ from its northern Borneo coastline reaches into the same contested southern zone. Under a straightforward reading of UNCLOS, these overlapping zones would need to be resolved through negotiation or adjudication, with each country receiving a portion based on equidistance or equity principles. That is how the convention expects it to work. China's position is different, and it is the position that makes the legal situation so complicated. China did not simply say its EEZ was larger than UNCLOS allows. It said that its rights in the South China Sea were based on historical grounds that predated UNCLOS and that could not be overridden by it. The instrument for this claim was the 9-dash line, a U-shaped boundary drawn across the South China Sea that enclosed roughly 90% of its total area within what China described as its historic waters. The line originated as an 11-dash line on a 1947 map produced by the Republic of China government, was later reduced to 9 dashes by the People's Republic of China, and was never officially explained in any precise legal terms. China did not publish geographic coordinates for the dashes. It did not clearly specify whether the line claimed sovereignty over the water itself, the resources within it, or only the islands and features the line enclosed. The ambiguity was probably intentional. A vague claim is harder to challenge than a precise one. What the 9-dash line effectively did was assert that China had historical rights in the South China Sea that were separate from and superior to the rights that UNCLOS would generate from its coastline. Under this view, China's entitlement was not derived from the 200 nautical mile rule. It was derived from centuries of use, discovery and administration, the same historical argument that had been contested for decades but now dressed in legal language. UNCLOS, China argued, did not extinguish pre-existing historical rights. It simply did not address them. The Philippines decided to test this argument formally. In January 2013, the Philippine government filed an arbitration case under Annex 7 of UNCLOS, submitting the dispute to a 5-member tribunal constituted under the auspices of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The Philippines was careful about what it asked the tribunal to decide. It did not ask the tribunal to rule on sovereignty over specific islands, because UNCLOS does not cover sovereignty disputes. Instead, it asked the tribunal to rule on whether China's 9-dash line claim was compatible with UNCLOS, and to clarify the maritime entitlements generated by specific features in the Spratly Islands. These were legal questions that fell within the tribunal's jurisdiction, at least in the Philippines' view. China disagreed. The Chinese government stated from the beginning that the tribunal had no jurisdiction over the case, that the Philippines had improperly initiated the proceedings, and that China would not participate. China submitted a position paper in 2014, arguing that the tribunal lacked jurisdiction, but then declined to appear for the substantive hearings. The tribunal proceeded without Chinese participation, which it was permitted to do under UNCLOS rules. China's absence did not stop the process. It just meant that only one side was presenting arguments. The tribunal's ruling came in July 2016, and it was comprehensive, detailed, and almost entirely in the Philippines' favour. On the central question of the 9-dash line, the tribunal was unambiguous. It found that China's claim to historic rights over the resources within the 9-dash line had no legal basis under UNCLOS. The convention, the tribunal said, had superseded any earlier historic rights that China might have had to the living and non-living resources of the sea. China could not claim rights to fish or extract resources across 90% of the South China Sea simply by pointing to old maps and historical usage. The convention drew a different set of rules, and China had signed it. The tribunal also made specific findings about the features in the Spratly Islands, and these findings were significant. Under UNCLOS, a full island that can sustain human habitation or an independent economic life generates a 12 nautical mile territorial sea and a full 200 nautical mile EEZ. A rock that cannot sustain habitation generates only a territorial sea. A low tide elevation, meaning a feature that is submerged at high tide, generates no maritime zones at all on its own. The tribunal examined the features that China claimed as islands and found that none of them qualified as full islands under this definition. Itu Aba, the largest natural feature in the Spratlys, which is occupied by Taiwan and also claimed by China, was found to be a rock under UNCLOS, not an island, because it could not sustain human habitation without external supply. Mischief Reef and Subi Reef were found to be low-tide elevations located within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Scarborough Shoal was found to be a rock. The implication was that even if China had sovereignty over these features, which the tribunal did not rule on, they would generate only minimal maritime zones, not the sweeping resource rights that China had been asserting. The tribunal also found that China had violated the Philippines' sovereign rights under UNCLOS by interfering with Philippine fishing and oil exploration activities within the Philippine EEZ by constructing artificial islands on features within the Philippine EEZ and by failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from harvesting endangered species at Scarborough Shoal. The ruling was thorough, legally careful, and backed by extensive analysis. It was, in the language of international law, about as clear a decision as you're likely to get. China's response was immediate and absolute. The Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling the ruling null and void, and without binding force. State media described it as a farce. Senior officials said China would not accept or recognise it under any circumstances. The 9-dash line remained on Chinese maps, on Chinese passports, on Chinese airline seatback screens, on Chinese product packaging. China did not modify its behaviour in the South China Sea in response to the ruling. Construction on the artificial islands continued. Coast Guard patrols continued. The claim did not shrink by a single dash. This created what lawyers and diplomats tend to call a legal vacuum, though that phrase perhaps understates the problem. The ruling did not disappear. It exists. It is a valid decision of an arbitral tribunal constituted under a treaty that China signed. Other countries, including the United States, the European Union, Japan and Australia, have stated that the ruling is final and binding. But a ruling is only as effective as the willingness of the losing party to comply with it or the ability of others to enforce it. There is no international police force for maritime law. There is no mechanism to compel China to accept the ruling. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea can issue opinions and orders, but it cannot dispatch ships to enforce them. UNCLOS has no army. What the 2016 ruling did accomplish was to clarify the legal position for everyone watching. Any country that accepts UNCLOS, which includes almost every nation on Earth, now has a clear legal basis for saying that China's 9-dash line claim is invalid. Diplomatic statements can reference the ruling. Countries can cite it in negotiations. It provides a framework for coalitions of nations that want to push back against Chinese maritime behaviour. The Philippines itself, under different administrations, has alternately emphasised and downplayed the ruling, depending on the political relationship with Beijing at any given moment. President Rodrigo Duterte, who was in office when the ruling was issued, largely set it aside in favour of closer ties with China. Later administrations returned to it as a legal anchor. The ruling also clarified something that had been somewhat murky before, which is the status of the artificial islands that China was building. Because the features underlying those islands were found to be either rocks or low-tide elevations, they do not generate EEZs. The land China added on top of them through dredging does not change their legal status under UNCLOS. An artificial island built on a low-tide elevation is still, in legal terms, a low-tide elevation. The military bases China constructed on Mischief Reef and Subi Reef are, under the tribunal's analysis, sitting on features located within the Philippine EEZ, with no legal entitlement of their own. China's physical presence there is legally unsupported by any framework that the international community recognises. None of which has made China remove them. This is the central frustration of the legal story of the South China Sea. The law is reasonably clear. The ruling was thorough. The legal community's consensus is fairly strong, and the situation on the water has continued to develop in the direction that the ruling said was illegal. This is not a new problem in international law. History offers many examples of nations ignoring legal findings when they have the power to do so, and the political will to absorb the diplomatic costs. But the South China Sea case is striking in its directness. The gap between what the law says and what is happening is not narrow or ambiguous. It is wide, documented and ongoing. There is also a separate irony worth noting. The United States, which has been one of the most vocal supporters of the 2016 ruling and the most consistent advocate for freedom of navigation under UNCLOS, has never itself ratified the convention. The US Senate has declined to ratify UNCLOS on multiple occasions, primarily due to concerns about provisions relating to deep-sea mining and international governance structures. This means that the United States is calling on China to comply with a treaty that the United States has not formally joined, which gives China a rhetorical point that it uses regularly. It is not a point that defeats the legal argument, because the EEZ rules in UNCLOS largely reflect customary international law that binds all nations regardless of whether they have signed the treaty. But it is a point that complicates the diplomacy, and in this sea, complications tend to compound. What the legal architecture of the South China Sea dispute ultimately reveals is that international law functions best when the parties involved are willing to accept constraints on their behaviour, and it functions poorly when a powerful state decides that the rules do not apply to it. UNCLOS was built on the assumption that nations would find it in their interest to follow its rules, because the rules would protect their interests too. That logic holds for most maritime disputes around the world, but it depends on a rough equality of power, or at least a rough acceptance that no single state can simply override the system. When one state is large enough, powerful enough, and determined enough to reject a legal outcome, the system's limits become visible. The South China Sea is where those limits are most visible right now, and while lawyers in The Hague were writing their rulings, and diplomats were issuing statements, and governments were citing legal precedents at each other across conference tables, something else was happening. Something that did not wait for legal clarity and did not need it. On the reefs and shoals of the Spratly Islands, a physical transformation was underway that would make the legal arguments feel, to some observers, almost beside the point. Because you can dispute a ruling, but it is harder to dispute a runway. That last word is worth sitting with for a moment. A runway. Not a diplomatic note, not a legal brief, not a carefully worded communique from a foreign ministry. A runway. Poured concrete several kilometres long, wide enough for military aircraft, sitting on what used to be a coral reef barely visible at low tide. That is the kind of fact that changes the texture of a conversation. The construction began quietly, as these things often do. Around 2013 and into 2014, satellite imagery analysts started noticing something unusual in the Spratly Islands. Chinese vessels, large dredging ships, were appearing near certain reefs and staying. Not passing through, staying. And behind them, where there had been water and coral and the occasional low shimmer of exposed rock at low tide, land was beginning to appear. The reefs that China focused on were not chosen randomly. Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef were among the most strategically positioned features in the Spratlys. Fiery Cross sits near the western edge of the island chain, close to major shipping lanes. Subi Reef is one of the largest features in the northern Spratlys. Mischief Reef, perhaps the most symbolically significant of the three, sits well within what the 2016 tribunal confirmed is the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. It is not close to the boundary, it is clearly inside it. The method was straightforward in engineering terms, though the scale was extraordinary. Dredging ships would pump sand and sediment from the surrounding seafloor up onto the reef surface, gradually building elevation above the waterline. Coral was not carefully avoided, it was buried. The process was fast by the standards of land creation. By the middle of 2015, Analysts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, working through their Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, had calculated that China had created more than 3,200 acres of new land across the 7 features it was working on in the Spratlys. To put that in some kind of physical context, that is roughly 5 times the size of Central Park in New York, built on top of living reef systems in less than 2 years. The Center for Strategic and International Studies had been tracking the construction through commercial satellite imagery, releasing updates that showed the transformation in time-lapse detail. The images became some of the most widely circulated photographs of the South China Sea dispute because they made the abstract concrete. You could look at a satellite image from 2013 showing a submerged reef with a small Chinese presence, and then look at an image from 2015 showing a rectangular island with buildings, a harbour, and the early outline of a runway. And the change was not subtle. It was not something that required expert interpretation. It was simply visible. Mischief Reef may be the clearest example of what this transformation looked like in practice. In the early 1990s, China established a small presence there, describing it at the time as a shelter for fishing vessels. The Philippines protested, the international community expressed concern, and then largely moved on. By the late 1990s, structures had grown slightly. By the mid-2010s, when the dredging began in earnest, Mischief Reef became something else entirely. The reef that had been a low-tide elevation, a feature that barely existed above the waterline under natural conditions, was transformed into a substantial island with a full military installation. A harbour capable of accommodating large vessels, buildings, radar equipment, and eventually a runway long enough to handle fighter aircraft and large military transport planes. Fiery Cross Reef followed a similar trajectory. The runway built there stretches approximately 3,125 metres, which is long enough for virtually any aircraft in China's military inventory. Hangars were constructed alongside it. Underground fuel storage was reported. Surface-to-air missile systems were installed. In February 2016, imagery confirmed the presence of HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries on Woody Island in the Paracels, and similar systems were subsequently identified or reported at the Spratly installations. The HQ-9 has a range of roughly 200 kilometres. From Fiery Cross Reef, that coverage extends over a significant portion of the central Spratly Islands and into waters claimed by Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. What China built was not a series of fishing shelters or weather stations, or even modest administrative outposts. What China built was a network of military bases in the middle of a sea it claims in full, but does not legally own under any framework the international community accepts. Each base is separated from the others by enough distance that they function as mutually supporting positions. Together, they give China a persistent military presence in the heart of the Spratlys that it did not have before, and that would be extremely difficult to dislodge without a major military operation. China's official position throughout the construction was that the activity was legal, defensive, and limited. Officials stated that the islands would serve civilian purposes, including weather monitoring, maritime search and rescue, and navigation aids. Some of this is true in a narrow sense. The installations do include lighthouse structures and weather equipment. But the runways, the hangars, the radar systems, the missile batteries, and the berthing facilities for naval vessels are not search and rescue infrastructure. They are military infrastructure, and the distinction is not subtle. There is an interesting detail about the timing of all this that is worth pausing on. The Philippines filed its arbitration case in January 2013. The major dredging operations began in 2013 and 2014. The arbitration tribunal was working through its proceedings during the same years that the islands were being built. By the time the tribunal issued its ruling in July 2016, invalidating China's historical rights claims and confirming that the underlying features had no EEZ entitlements, the physical reality on the reefs had already changed in ways that no legal ruling could reverse. You can declare a runway legally irrelevant. you cannot make it disappear. This sequencing is not necessarily proof of deliberate strategy, though many analysts believe it was. It is possible to read the construction timeline as China deciding that the legal process was going to produce an unfavourable outcome and moving quickly to establish physical facts before the ruling landed. It is also possible to read it as separate parallel processes that happen to overlap. What is harder to dispute is the effect. Whatever the intent, the result was that by the time the legal framework had spoken clearly, the physical situation had already moved well past the point where the legal framework could easily constrain it. The strategic geometry of the South China Sea shifted in ways that military analysts spent considerable effort trying to quantify. Before the island construction, China's nearest significant military bases were on Hainan Island and in the Paracel Islands, both of which are in the northern part of the sea. The Spratlys are roughly 1,200 kilometres south of Hainan. Sustaining a military presence there from that distance is logistically difficult. Aircraft have limited range. Ships take time to transit. In any confrontation, response time matters. The new bases in the Spratlys change that calculation. Chinese aircraft operating from Fiery Cross Reef can reach virtually any point in the South China Sea within a relatively short flight time. Chinese Coast Guard and naval vessels based at the new harbours can respond to incidents in the Spratlys far more quickly than they could from Hainan. The sea, in operational terms, became smaller for China. For everyone else, it became more complicated. Vietnam, which has its own facilities in the Spratlys, found Chinese military assets closer to its coastline than before. The Philippines found that a feature sitting inside its own EEZ now hosted a foreign military base. Malaysia, which has a small presence on Swallow Reef, found itself in a sea where the balance of physical presence had shifted noticeably. Taiwan, which occupies Itu Aba, the largest natural island in the Spratlys, continued its quiet presence while watching the construction with its own set of concerns. The United States responded through diplomatic channels and through a specific kind of military action. Freedom of navigation operations, which we will come back to in more detail later, sent naval vessels through waters near the new islands to assert that the construction had not changed the legal status of the surrounding sea. The operations were carefully calibrated to avoid direct confrontation while making a clear legal point. They also made clear that the US Navy intended to keep operating in those waters regardless of what China built on the reefs below. China's response to American freedom of navigation operations was consistent. Chinese naval and Coast Guard vessels would shadow the American ships, issue verbal warnings over radio, and occasionally maneuver in ways that came close enough to the American vessels to require careful navigation. Neither side wanted a collision. Both sides were making a point. The American point was that the islands had not created legal exclusion zones. The Chinese point was that the islands were Chinese territory, and that foreign military vessels were not welcome nearby. Both points were being made simultaneously in close proximity, with ships that are capable of doing a great deal of damage to each other. What is perhaps most striking about the island building story when you step back from the strategic details is the sheer physical audacity of it. China did not find an uninhabited island and establish a base there. It created islands where there had been none, on top of living reef systems, in waters claimed by multiple other nations, in direct defiance of an ongoing international legal process, and it did so openly, at a pace that satellite imagery made impossible to hide. The construction was not covert. It was conducted in plain view of commercial satellites, naval vessels and reconnaissance aircraft. China knew the world was watching and continued anyway. There is a phrase that comes up in discussions of Chinese foreign policy called the salami slicing strategy, a term used by analysts to describe a pattern of making small, incremental advances that individually seem insufficient to justify a strong response, but that cumulatively produce a major shift in the strategic situation. Whether or not that framing fully captures Chinese decision-making, it describes the arc of the island construction reasonably well. Each dredging ship that arrived, Each layer of sand that was pumped onto a reef, each structure that went up was a small step. But the cumulative result was 7 military installations in the heart of the South China Sea, built in roughly 2 years, on features that the international legal community agrees belong to no one, or at most to the common heritage of mankind under the seabed provisions of UNCLOS. The environmental cost of all this construction is something we will return to later in this story, because it is significant and largely underreported. Thousands of acres of coral reef were buried or destroyed in the process. Fish nursery habitats were eliminated. The ecological damage is, by any reasonable measure, irreversible on any human timescale. But the immediate strategic story is the one that reshaped the political geography of the region, and it is the one that every other country in the sea had to respond to. Some of those responses were legal, some were diplomatic, some were military, some were a mixture of all three, adjusted carefully depending on the size of the country, the depth of its relationship with China, and the specific features it was trying to protect. Vietnam built more structures on the features it already occupied. The Philippines, with far fewer resources and a much more complicated domestic political relationship with the issue, relied partly on legal arguments, partly on American support, and partly on a small rusting warship deliberately grounded on a shoal as a kind of living flag. Malaysia quietly maintained its presence without escalating. Taiwan sat on its island and watched. Each of those responses is its own story, shaped by its own history and its own calculations about what is possible and what is too dangerous. And that is where the story of the South China Sea goes next, because the construction of the Chinese islands was not the end of the contest. It was, in many ways, the moment that forced every other party to decide what they were willing to do and what they were willing to accept. So let us spend some time with the other players. The ones who did not build runways or deploy missile batteries, but who have been here longer than any of those installations, whose fishermen have worked these waters for generations, and whose governments have had to make very careful decisions about how hard to push back against a neighbour that is considerably larger and considerably more willing to act. Vietnam is, in many ways, the most active of the secondary claimants. It occupies 21 features in the Spratly Islands, more than any other country except China, and it has been building and reinforcing its own structures there for decades. The Vietnamese presence is not new. Vietnamese fishing communities have operated in these waters for centuries, and the government in Hanoi has consistently maintained that the Paracel and Spratly Islands are Vietnamese territory, a position it holds with considerable historical documentation behind it. After China seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam in 1974, during a brief but deadly naval battle in which 74 South Vietnamese sailors were killed, Vietnam has never stopped viewing China's presence in the South China Sea as an existential issue rather than merely a diplomatic one. The memory of 1974 is not abstract in Hanoi. It is part of the institutional memory of how this sea works. Vietnam's structures in the Spratlys are more modest than China's. There are no 3-kilometre runways, no radar arrays visible from commercial satellites at the scale that Fiery Cross Reef displays. But Vietnam has expanded its facilities in recent years, building longer jetties, reinforcing existing outposts, and improving the conditions for the small garrisons that live on these features year-round. Some of those features are little more than platforms built above the waterline, with a small group of soldiers and enough supplies to last until the next resupply vessel arrives. It is not a comfortable existence. But Vietnam has made clear through its sustained presence that it is not prepared to simply cede these features without a fight. The relationship between Vietnam and China in the South China Sea is complicated by the fact that the two countries share a long land border, deep historical ties, and a communist political system, and yet have fought each other at sea and on land within living memory. The 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, the 1988 battle at Johnson South Reef in the Spratlys, where 64 Vietnamese sailors were killed by Chinese forces, and the 2014 standoff over the Chinese oil rig HD 981, which we will return to in more detail later, have all reinforced a Vietnamese national understanding that China is not simply a rival claimant, but a recurring threat. Vietnam has responded to China's island construction by deepening its relationships with other countries, expanding its own naval capabilities, and carefully calibrating how loudly it protests at any given moment. It cannot afford a direct military confrontation with China, but it also cannot afford to appear passive, because its domestic political legitimacy is partly tied to its willingness to defend what it describes as its sovereign territory. The Philippines presents a different kind of story, where Vietnam has responded with its own construction and a consistent legal and diplomatic posture. The Philippines has relied, at certain critical moments, on something more improvised. Something that is, depending on your perspective, either quietly brilliant or simply the best option available to a country with limited resources and an enormous amount at stake. In 1999, the Philippine Navy deliberately ran an aging warship aground on a submerged shoal in the Spratly Islands called Second Thomas Shoal, known in the Philippines as Ayungin Shoal. The ship was the BRP Sierra Madre, a former United States Navy vessel that had been transferred to the Philippines in 1976. It was already old when it was grounded. It is older still now. The hull is rusting, the superstructure is corroded. Parts of it are held together in ways that would not pass any naval inspection. And yet, for 25 years, a small rotating crew of Philippine Marines has lived aboard that ship, sleeping in bunks surrounded by rust, eating food and drinking water brought by resupply missions from the mainland, maintaining a physical human presence on a feature that sits squarely within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. The logic of the Sierra Madre is simple. If the Philippines abandons the ship, China will almost certainly occupy the shoal, as it has occupied other features in the region. The ship's presence, however deteriorated, constitutes a legal and physical claim. It is a flag made of rust and determination. The Marines who rotate through duty on the Sierra Madre are, in a very real sense, the living embodiment of Philippine sovereignty over that feature. They are there precisely because leaving would mean losing it. What has made Second Thomas Shoal one of the most closely watched flashpoints in the South China Sea in recent years is what happens when the Philippines tries to resupply the Sierra Madre. China has repeatedly attempted to block or disrupt those missions. In 2023 and into 2024, the situation escalated significantly. Chinese Coast Guard vessels used water cannons against Philippine resupply boats, including military vessels carrying food, water, and building materials to the Marines on the Sierra Madre. In some incidents, Philippine sailors were injured. In others, supplies were damaged or confiscated. The Chinese vessels physically maneuvered to block the path of the Philippine boats, coming close enough that collisions were narrowly avoided on multiple occasions. These were not distant, abstract confrontations between governments. They were physical confrontations between boats and sailors on open water, with water cannons and hulls, and the real possibility of something going badly wrong. The Philippine government protested each incident. Videos of the confrontations circulated widely. The United States, under the terms of its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, issued statements affirming that the treaty applied to Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, which we will return to in the next part of this story. But the resupply missions continued, and so did the Chinese attempts to interfere with them, and the Marines on the Sierra Madre continued to wait in their rusting ship for the next boat to arrive. Malaysia occupies a quieter position in this story, though not an absent one. Malaysia claims parts of the southern Spratly Islands and occupies a small number of features, including Swallow Reef, known in Malay as Terumbu Layang Layang. Swallow Reef is unusual among the occupied features of the South China Sea, because it hosts not only a small Malaysian naval facility, but also a dive resort, a place that has, at various points, been open to tourists who want to experience the extraordinary coral ecosystems of the southern Spratlys. The combination of a naval garrison and a scuba resort on the same remote reef is, to put it gently, a particular kind of geopolitical arrangement that you would not find in many other places. Malaysia's approach to the South China Sea has generally been quieter than Vietnam's or the Philippines. Kuala Lumpur tends to prefer bilateral diplomacy over public confrontation, partly because of its significant economic ties with China, and partly because of its own domestic political calculations. This has sometimes drawn criticism from analysts who argue that Malaysia's quiet approach effectively allows Chinese expansion to proceed without meaningful resistance. But Malaysia has also made clear, when pressed, that it does not accept Chinese claims over its continental shelf, and its navy has maintained a presence in the features it occupies. It simply does so without generating as many headlines. Taiwan's situation in the South China Sea is perhaps the most unusual of all. Taiwan occupies Itu Aba, which is also called Taiping Island, the largest naturally occurring island in the Spratly archipelago, roughly 1.5 kilometres long. Taiwan has maintained a garrison there since 1956, and the island has a small airstrip, a lighthouse, a freshwater well, a medical clinic, and a Coast Guard detachment. In legal terms, Itu Aba's status as a naturally occurring island rather than a reef or low tide elevation matters considerably, because under UNCLOS, a natural island capable of sustaining human habitation generates its own exclusive economic zone. Taiwan has argued that Itu Aba qualifies as such an island, though the 2016 arbitration tribunal disagreed and classified it as a rock under UNCLOS, which limits its maritime entitlements. Taiwan's claim to the South China Sea is, in some ways, even broader than China's. The 9-dash line originated with the Republic of China government, which retreated to Taiwan in 1949, and Taiwan has historically maintained a claim to the entire Spratly and Paracel Island groups. This creates a peculiar situation in which Taiwan and the People's Republic of China make nearly identical territorial claims against all the other claimants, even as they are in a state of political and military tension with each other. Taiwan has not been a party to the multilateral negotiations over the South China Sea because of its complicated international status, but it has maintained its physical presence on Itu Aba consistently and without much fanfare. What is striking about all of these responses taken together is how much they differ from one another, and how clearly each one reflects the specific circumstances of the country making it. Vietnam builds and maintains structures because it has the capacity to do so and the historical motivation to resist Chinese expansion directly. The Philippines grounds a warship because it cannot afford to build what China has built, but it can afford to keep a crew of Marines on a shoal indefinitely. Malaysia maintains a quiet presence and a dive resort because that suits its domestic and diplomatic situation. Taiwan sits on its island and watches, maintaining a claim that is legally complicated but physically real. None of these responses has reversed what China built. The runways are still there, the missile batteries are still there, the harbours are still there. The strategic geometry of the sea has changed, and the other claimants are working within a new reality rather than an old one. But their presence matters. It matters legally, because occupied features generate maritime claims that would not exist if they were abandoned. It matters politically, because it keeps the question of sovereignty alive in international forums, and it matters practically because it keeps the sea from becoming, in any simple sense, a Chinese lake. The confrontations at Second Thomas Shoal in 2023 and 2024 illustrated something important about where the South China Sea dispute currently sits. The most dangerous flashpoints are not the large military installations, where both sides have invested enough that neither wants to risk a direct engagement. The most dangerous flashpoints are the small, everyday interactions, the resupply boats and the Coast Guard vessels, the fishing boats and the water cannons, the moments where individual captains and crew members are making real-time decisions about how close is too close and when to hold their course and when to turn away. These are the moments where accidents happen. These are the moments where a miscalculation by someone who is tired, or frightened, or following orders that leave little room for judgment can become something that governments have to respond to. Brunei is sometimes listed among the South China Sea claimants, and technically it does claim a section of continental shelf that overlaps with Chinese and Malaysian claims in the southern Spratlys. But Brunei has no occupied features, and has generally kept its head down on the issue, pursuing its claims through quiet diplomacy while relying heavily on its economic relationship with China. It is a reminder that not every claimant has the same capacity or the same appetite for confrontation. Indonesia does not formally claim any of the contested islands, but it has found itself drawn into the dispute anyway, because China's 9-dash line overlaps with Indonesia's exclusive economic zone around the Natuna Islands, a group of islands in the southern South China Sea. Indonesia has repeatedly rejected any suggestion that China has historical fishing rights in the waters around the Natunas, and in 2019 and 2020, there were several incidents in which Chinese fishing vessels, accompanied by Chinese Coast Guard ships, entered the Natuna EEZ and were confronted by Indonesian naval vessels. Indonesia renamed the relevant part of its EEZ the North Natuna Sea, partly as a political statement, and deployed additional military assets to the region. Jakarta has been careful to avoid framing this as a territorial dispute in the same sense as the Spratly and Paracel arguments, because it does not want to legitimise the idea that the Natunas are in any way contested. But the practical reality is that Chinese fishing fleets have repeatedly entered waters that Indonesia considers its own, and Indonesia has had to respond. All of this, the Vietnamese outposts, the rusting Sierra Madre, the Malaysian resort, the Taiwanese garrison, the Indonesian naval patrols around the Natunas, adds up to a sea that is far more crowded with competing claims, competing vessels and competing histories than its surface suggests. From a satellite image, it looks like open water with a scattering of small features. From closer up, it is a place where governments have made enormous investments in physical presence, legal argument and diplomatic manoeuvring, all in an effort to hold on to something in a sea where the rules about who owns what have never been fully settled and may never be. And through all of it, the United States has been watching, calculating and acting in its own way. Not as a claimant, but as a power with interest in every corner of this sea, with alliances to honour and strategic calculations of its own to manage. America's role in the South China Sea is complicated, and it is the piece of this story that, in many ways, determines how all the other pieces fit together. The United States does not claim a single reef, a single rock, or a single square kilometre of water in the South China Sea. It has never occupied a feature there. It has no territorial ambition, at least none that it has ever stated, and none that most analysts believe it holds. And yet, in a very practical sense, the United States is one of the most consequential presences in that sea. Its warships pass through regularly, its aircraft fly overhead, its diplomats issue statements, its admirals give press conferences, and its alliance commitments shape the calculations of every government with a stake in what happens there. Understanding why requires stepping back from the geography of the sea itself and thinking about what the sea means to American strategic interests, which turns out to be quite a lot. The core American interest is not territorial, it is navigational. The United States has long maintained that the world's oceans must remain open to freedom of navigation for all vessels, military and commercial alike, and that no country has the right to restrict that freedom by asserting expansive territorial claims that go beyond what international law permits. This is not a principle the United States invented specifically to counter China. It is a principle the US Navy has enforced globally, including in places where the United States had no particular political interest at stake, because the principle itself is considered foundational to the international order that the United States helped build after the Second World War and has a strong interest in maintaining. A world in which major maritime powers can simply declare large stretches of ocean to be under their exclusive control and then back that declaration with military force, is a world in which the movement of goods, military assets and information becomes subject to the permission of whoever happens to be the strongest local power. That is not a world the United States wants to live in. So when China began asserting its 9-dash line claim, and then started building military installations on artificial islands in the Spratly Islands, The United States responded not by contesting China's sovereignty claims directly, which is a position the US government has officially avoided taking, but by conducting what are called Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs. The idea behind a FONOP is straightforward. A US Navy vessel sails through waters where another country has made a claim that the United States considers inconsistent with international law, and it does so without requesting permission and without giving prior notification. The act of sailing through is itself the message. It is a statement that the United States does not accept the legal validity of the claim being made, and that it will continue to exercise what it regards as its lawful right of navigation regardless. The first major modern FONOP in the South China Sea came in October 2015, when the guided missile destroyer USS Lassen sailed within 12 nautical miles of Subi Reef, one of the artificial islands China had built in the Spratly Islands. 12 nautical miles is the standard territorial sea limit under international law, the zone within which a coastal state has full sovereignty over the water and the airspace above it. By sailing within that zone, the United States was making the argument that Subi Reef, as an artificially constructed feature built on what had been a submerged reef, was not entitled to a territorial sea at all under the rules set out by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China predictably condemned the operation as illegal and provocative. The USS Lassen completed its passage without incident, shadowed by 2 Chinese naval vessels that issued warnings but did not physically interfere. The Lassen operation had been anticipated for months. There had been considerable internal debate within the Obama administration about whether to conduct it, how close to sail, and what legal theory to invoke. The delay in ordering the first FONOP had itself become a story, with some analysts arguing that the administration's hesitation had sent the wrong signal to Beijing during the critical period when China's island building was accelerating. Once the Lassen sailed, the operations became more regular. Under the Trump administration, the pace of FONOPs actually increased, with multiple operations per quarter in some periods. The Biden administration continued them as well. By the early 2020s, freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea had become a routine feature of US naval activity in the region, conducted so regularly that individual operations rarely made major headlines unless something unusual happened. What the FONOPs accomplish in a practical sense is debated. China has not withdrawn from any of its artificial islands. It has not modified its 9-line claim. It has not accepted the 2016 arbitration ruling. In that sense, the operations have not changed the facts on the water. What they have done is maintain the legal and symbolic record that the United States has never accepted China's claims as legitimate, and that American vessels will continue to exercise navigational rights that the US considers lawful. Whether that matters in the long run depends on whether international legal norms ultimately have any constraining effect on Chinese behaviour, which is a question nobody can answer with confidence right now. The more concrete dimension of American involvement comes through its alliance commitments. The United States signed a mutual defence treaty with the Philippines in 1951, during the early Cold War period when the strategic logic was primarily about deterring Soviet aggression and managing the aftermath of the Pacific War. The treaty commits each party to act to meet the common danger if either is attacked by an external party in the Pacific area. For decades, there was genuine ambiguity about whether that commitment extended to Philippine vessels and forces in the South China Sea, particularly in the contested areas around the Spratly Islands and Scarborough Shoal. China was presumably counting on that ambiguity to some degree. In 2023, the Biden administration moved to close that ambiguity significantly. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made an explicit public statement that the Mutual Defense Treaty covers Philippine armed forces, public vessels and aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea, including in the event of an armed attack by China. This was not a new treaty. It was a clarification, or more precisely a reaffirmation, of how the existing treaty would be interpreted. But the specificity of the language mattered. By naming China explicitly, and by covering not just military forces but public vessels, which includes Coast Guard ships, the statement was clearly designed to address the kinds of incidents that had been happening at Second Thomas Shoal, where Chinese Coast Guard vessels had been using water cannons and physical obstruction against Philippine resupply missions. Whether this commitment would actually be honoured in a real confrontation is a question that nobody can answer until it is tested, and everyone hopes it will not be tested. But the statement changed the diplomatic calculus at least somewhat. It gave the Philippines more confidence to continue its resupply missions to the CSP Sierra Madre. It gave China something additional to think about before deciding how aggressively to escalate, and it signalled to other countries in the region that the United States was not retreating from its alliance commitments in the face of Chinese pressure. The United States also maintains a significant military presence in the broader region. Carrier strike groups transit the South China Sea periodically, which is itself a statement of capability and intent. In 2020, during a period of heightened tension, the US Navy conducted dual carrier operations in the South China Sea for the first time in years, with the USS Nimitz and USS Ronald Reagan operating together. These deployments are not aimed at any specific incident. They are demonstrations of the kind of military power the United States can project into the region if it chooses to, and they are read carefully by every government in Asia. The United States has also deepened its military cooperation with the Philippines in recent years. Under a 2014 agreement called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the US military gained access to several Philippine military bases for rotating deployments. In 2023, the Philippines announced 4 additional sites under that agreement, some of them in the northern Philippines near Taiwan, which added a dimension to the arrangement that went beyond the South China Sea dispute. American forces conducting exercises and maintenance operations at Philippine bases represent a form of presence that is less visible than a carrier strike group, but arguably more enduring. The tension in all of this, and it is a real tension that American policymakers have wrestled with for years, is that the United States has enormous economic ties with China. The two economies are deeply intertwined in ways that make a clean strategic confrontation extraordinarily costly for both sides. China is one of the largest trading partners of the United States. American companies have massive investments in China. Chinese companies and investors have significant holdings in the United States. The financial relationship between the two countries is not a reason to abandon alliance commitments or accept Chinese territorial expansion, but it is a reason why American policy has consistently tried to maintain what officials describe as a stable relationship with China, even while pushing back on specific behaviours. The phrase that gets used repeatedly is that the United States seeks competition without conflict, which is a reasonable goal, but an extremely difficult one to sustain when the competition is happening on and around contested islands in a sea where both sides have military assets. There is also the question of what other countries in the region make of all this. The smaller claimants, Vietnam and the Philippines in particular, want American engagement in the South China Sea because it provides a counterweight to Chinese pressure that they cannot provide themselves. But they also have to manage their own relationships with China, which is their largest trading partner and a neighbour they will be living next to regardless of how the American political mood shifts. The Philippines, under different precedents, has taken different approaches to the question of how closely to align with the United States versus how much accommodation to offer China. Under Rodrigo Duterte, from 2016 to 2022, the relationship with Washington cooled considerably, and Duterte at various points suggested he might allow the Mutual Defense Treaty to lapse or accept Chinese terms on the South China Sea in exchange for investment. Under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who took office in 2022, the relationship with the United States warmed again sharply, and the Philippines moved toward closer military cooperation and a more assertive posture at Second Thomas Shoal. Vietnam has its own complicated relationship with American involvement. It fought a devastating war against the United States within living memory, and it has no formal defense alliance with Washington. but it has gradually moved toward a closer security relationship with the US as its concerns about Chinese behaviour in the South China Sea have grown. In 2023, the two countries upgraded their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is the highest level of diplomatic relationship Vietnam maintains, and which had previously been reserved for Vietnam's closest partners, including China itself. The upgrade was partly symbolic, but it reflected a real shift in how Hanoi was thinking about its strategic options. None of this adds up to a simple picture of the United States as a benevolent protector of small nations against a powerful aggressor. American interests in the South China Sea are real and specific. Freedom of navigation matters to the United States because American naval power depends on it globally. Alliance credibility matters because the entire architecture of American security commitments in Asia depends on partners believing those commitments are real. Preventing any single power from dominating the South China Sea matters because a China that controls access to $3.5 trillion of annual trade flows and the approaches to the Pacific is a strategically different China than the one the United States has managed its relationship with for the past several decades. These are not altruistic motivations, and nobody in Washington pretends they are. But they do align, at least partially, with the interests of the smaller claimants who are trying to preserve their access to fishing grounds, their rights to explore for oil and gas in their own exclusive economic zones, and their ability to navigate their own waters without asking permission from Beijing. The alignment of interests is real, even if the motivations are different. What all of this means for the actual day-to-day situation in the South China Sea is that there are now multiple layers of deterrence, legal argument, alliance commitment, and military presence all operating simultaneously in a relatively small body of water. Chinese Coast Guard vessels shadow Philippine resupply boats. American destroyers sail past Chinese artificial islands. Vietnamese fishing boats work reefs that Chinese vessels also patrol. Malaysian Coast Guard ships watch the southern approaches to the Spratlys. And somewhere in all of that activity, the possibility of a miscalculation that none of the governments involved actually wants is always present. The sea has been contested for a long time, but the particular combination of military hardware, legal uncertainty, alliance commitments, and great power competition that now characterises it is something genuinely new. The question of what happens next, whether the current pattern of managed tension holds, whether something triggers a sharper confrontation, whether diplomacy finds a way through, is one that analysts in Washington, Beijing, Manila, Hanoi, and every other capital with a stake in the answer are working on with considerable urgency and no reliable answers. But before we get to that question, there is something else worth understanding about this sea. Something that has nothing to do with navies, or treaties, or artificial islands, or alliance commitments. The South China Sea is dangerous in ways that predate all of those things by millions of years, and that will still be dangerous long after the current political arguments have been resolved or replaced by new ones. The sea itself has its own physics, its own weather, its own geography, and its own capacity to harm anyone who crosses it, without sufficient respect for what it actually is. The South China Sea has been generating typhoons for as long as it has existed in its current form, and it is very good at it. The warm, shallow waters of the sea act as a kind of engine for tropical cyclone development, feeding energy upward into the atmosphere and allowing storms to intensify rapidly before they make landfall. The sea sits directly within what meteorologists call the Western Pacific Typhoon Basin, which is the most active tropical cyclone basin on the planet. Roughly a third of all the world's tropical cyclones form or pass through this region each year, and while not every storm that crosses the South China Sea becomes catastrophic, the ones that do can be almost incomprehensibly powerful. Typhoon Haiyan is the number that most people reach for when they want to describe what the sea is capable of producing. It formed over the warm waters of the Western Pacific in early November 2013, crossed into the South China Sea, and made landfall in the Philippines on November 8th, with sustained winds measured at around 315 km per hour. Some gusts were recorded even higher. The storm surge that accompanied the landfall reached up to 7 meters in places, which is roughly the height of a 2-story building simply arriving as water. The city of Tacloban was devastated. Over 6,300 people died. More than 4 million were displaced. The storm caused damage estimated at around $2 billion, though that number only captures what could be counted and priced. The scale of what Haiyan did in a matter of hours to communities that had existed for generations is the kind of thing that takes years to fully absorb. What made Haiyan so powerful was partly the unusually warm sea surface temperatures it travelled over. The South China Sea in November still holds enormous heat from the summer months, and Haiyan was able to maintain its intensity across the water, rather than weakening as storms sometimes do when they pass over cooler patches. This is not unusual for the region. The sea routinely produces storms of significant intensity because the thermal energy available to them is consistently high. Climate scientists have noted that as ocean temperatures continue to rise, the conditions that allow storms like Haiyan to reach their maximum potential are likely to become more common. The South China Sea does not need to generate more typhoons to become more dangerous. It only needs the ones it already generates to arrive slightly stronger. But typhoons, for all their scale, are not the only physical danger the sea presents. The geography itself is a hazard in ways that are quieter and more persistent. The Spratly Islands, which sit roughly in the centre of the South China Sea, contain a region that mariners have called the dangerous ground for centuries, and the name is not decorative. This is an area of approximately 150,000 square kilometres in the southern Spratlys, where reefs, shoals and submerged banks rise unpredictably from the sea floor. Many of these features are only a few metres below the surface at low tide, invisible from a ship's deck and historically uncharted or inaccurately charted. Navigating through the dangerous ground without detailed knowledge of it is genuinely risky, and for most of maritime history that detailed knowledge was either unavailable or unreliable. The sea floor here is not a smooth slope. It is more like a broken landscape of ridges, walls, and sudden rises, with deep basins dropping to several hundred metres sitting directly adjacent to reefs that barely clear the waterline. A ship that miscalculates its position by even a small margin in the wrong part of the dangerous ground can find itself in serious trouble very quickly. Even modern GPS has not entirely eliminated the risk, partly because the charts derived from historical surveys in some areas of the Spratlys are not fully accurate, and partly because the reefs themselves are living structures that change shape over time as coral grows, dies, and is broken by storms. The Luzon Strait, which connects the South China Sea to the Pacific Ocean in the north, presents its own navigational challenges. Currents through the strait can be strong and variable, influenced by tidal flows, seasonal monsoon patterns, and the interplay between the different water masses on either side. The strait is also a major typhoon corridor, the path along which many storms enter the South China Sea from the Pacific. Ships transiting the strait have to contend with currents that can run at several knots, swells that build quickly in shallow water, and weather that can deteriorate with limited warning. It is one of the busier shipping lanes in the world, which means that at any given time there are large commercial vessels navigating conditions that demand careful attention. The historical record of what this sea has done to ships is long and specific. The sea floor of the South China Sea contains thousands of wrecks, accumulated over centuries of trade, war and accident. Chinese junks that sank while carrying ceramics and silk, Portuguese and Spanish vessels that went down in typhoons during the colonial era, Dutch East India Company ships that struck reefs they could not see. The wrecks are distributed across the seafloor like a scattered archive of every civilization that has tried to cross this water and failed. Marine archaeologists have found intact cargoes of Tang Dynasty ceramics, Song Dynasty porcelain, and Ming Dynasty goods in wrecks on the seafloor, preserved by the cold and pressure of the deep water. Some of these wrecks have been excavated carefully. Others have been looted by salvagers who pulled up the artifacts and sold them before any documentation could be made. the sea keeps its history imperfectly. The most dramatic single sinking in the South China Sea during the 20th century was not a merchant vessel but a warship. The Japanese battleship Musashi was sunk in the Sibuyan Sea, which sits just at the eastern edge of the South China Sea proper, in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Musashi was one of the two largest battleships ever built, displacing around 73,000 tons when fully loaded, carrying 9 460mm main guns and measuring over 260 metres in length. American aircraft attacked it in waves over several hours on October 24, 1944. The ship absorbed an extraordinary number of hits, somewhere between 17 and 19 aerial torpedoes, and an equal number of bombs by various estimates, before it finally rolled over and sank. Roughly half of its crew of around 2,400 men went down with it. The wreck was located in 2015 by a research team funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, sitting at a depth of around 1,300 metres. It had rested undisturbed on the seafloor for more than 70 years. The Musashi is the largest single object on the floor of this sea, but it is far from alone down there. The battles of the Second World War left dozens of warships scattered across the South China Sea and its adjacent waters. American, Japanese, British, Dutch and Australian vessels all went down in these waters between 1941 and 1945. Some of them are well documented, others were lost in confused night actions or in remote waters where no detailed record of the sinking was ever made. They lie at various depths, some accessible to recreational divers, others far beyond reach, and the sea holds them with the same indifference it holds everything else. For contemporary mariners, the physical dangers of the sea present themselves in more mundane but still consequential ways. The monsoon seasons bring reliable but strong winds and heavy seas. The northeast monsoon, which runs roughly from November to March, pushes swells down from the north and can make conditions uncomfortable or dangerous for smaller vessels. The southwest monsoon, from May to September, reverses the dominant wind direction and brings different sea states. Fishing boats and small commercial vessels operating in the sea have to plan around these patterns. Getting caught in the wrong sea state in a small boat in the South China Sea is not a theoretical risk. It happens regularly, and the people it happens to are usually not the ones who make international headlines. Navigation through the reef systems of the Spratlys and Paracels requires a level of care that does not diminish, simply because a vessel has modern electronics. The reef density in parts of the Spratlys is high enough that a ship moving at normal cruising speed through an area it has not carefully plotted can encounter a hazard before there is time to respond. The shallow water also affects radar returns and sonar readings in ways that can be confusing. In certain lighting conditions, particularly at dawn or dusk, reefs that are just below the surface can be almost invisible from a bridge. Experienced pilots who work this sea regularly talk about it with a particular kind of respect, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what it can do and having learnt that knowledge the hard way. There is also the matter of the weather patterns that are unique to this enclosed sea. Because the South China Sea is largely surrounded by land, the atmospheric dynamics within it are influenced by the land masses on all sides. The sea generates its own local weather systems that do not always match the broader regional forecast. Squalls can develop quickly over the warm water and move in unexpected directions. Visibility can drop from clear to near zero in a short time. The combination of reef hazards, strong currents, and rapidly changing weather makes the South China Sea genuinely demanding for navigators in ways that more open ocean passages are not. What is perhaps most striking about the physical dangers of this sea is that they have been consistent across all of recorded human history. The typhoons that devastated communities in 2013 are the same kind of storms that sank Chinese junks in the 14th century and Spanish galleons in the 17th. The reefs that ground ships today are the same reefs that earned the name Dangerous Ground, from sailors who had no satellite navigation and no accurate charts. The sea does not distinguish between a fishing boat and a warship, between a freighter carrying electronics and a wooden vessel carrying porcelain. It applies its physics evenly, without regard for the political arguments being conducted on its surface. This is worth holding on to for a moment, because so much of the conversation about the South China Sea focuses on the human dimensions of its danger, the territorial disputes, the military deployments, the legal arguments, the diplomatic failures. Those things are real and consequential, but underneath all of them is a body of water that was dangerous before any of those arguments existed, and that will continue to be dangerous regardless of how they are eventually resolved. The sea's natural hazards do not wait for a code of conduct to be signed. They do not suspend operations during diplomatic negotiations. They are simply there as they have always been, doing what warm, shallow seas in active typhoon corridors do. The people who understand this best are not the admirals or the diplomats or the legal scholars. They are the fishermen who have worked these waters for generations, the sailors who cross them regularly, the Coast Guard officers who respond when something goes wrong, and the search and rescue teams who know that in a bad typhoon season, the sea will claim people regardless of which flag they are sailing under. The natural danger of the South China Sea is a kind of equalizer, entirely indifferent to the nationality of whoever is crossing it. And yet, for all of that, the sea continues to be crossed. Millions of tons of cargo move through it every day. Fishing boats work its reefs every morning. Navies transit its waters in every direction. The sea is dangerous, and people have always known it, and they have always gone out onto it anyway, because the resources it holds and the routes it provides have always been worth the risk to someone. That calculation has not changed. If anything, as the populations around the sea have grown and the economies that depend on it have expanded, more people are making that calculation every year, not fewer. The physical sea and the political sea are not separate things. They occupy the same water. The typhoons do not pause for territorial disputes. The reefs do not move to accommodate military installations. The fish do not stay in one nation's exclusive economic zone out of diplomatic courtesy. The natural world of the South China Sea and the human world of the South China Sea are constantly interacting, and understanding one without the other leaves you with an incomplete picture of why this particular body of water has mattered so much to so many people for so long. What those reefs and those fish and those typhoons have sustained, destroyed and shaped over centuries brings us to something that sits beneath all the politics and all the navigation hazards and all the shipwrecks. Something that most of the arguments about this sea pay almost no attention to, even though it is arguably the most important thing the sea contains. Beneath the contested surface, beneath the military installations and the resupply missions and the freedom of navigation operations, there is an ecosystem of extraordinary complexity and fragility, one that has been quietly bearing the cost of everything happening above it. The South China Sea sits within one of the most biologically rich regions on the planet. That is not a casual observation. The Coral Triangle, which stretches across parts of Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste, and which touches the southern and eastern edges of the South China Sea, contains approximately 76% of all known coral species in the world. For comparison, the Caribbean, which most people think of as a coral-rich environment, contains around 65 species of coral. The Coral Triangle contains over 500. The difference is not small. It is the difference between a garden and a rainforest. The reefs of the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands sit within this extraordinary system. They are not peripheral or minor features of it. They are part of its core. The shallow reef platforms that rise from the Sunda Shelf in the central and southern parts of the sea provide habitat for an enormous range of marine life, including fish species that are critical food sources for hundreds of millions of people across the region. The interconnection between these reef systems means that damage to one area can have effects that ripple outward across a much larger biological network. Larvae drift on currents from reef to reef. Fish populations in one location depend on breeding grounds in another. The whole system is more integrated than it might appear from above the surface. What has happened to this ecosystem over the past several decades is genuinely difficult to describe without sounding alarmist. and yet the documented evidence is severe enough that measured language begins to feel inadequate. The combination of overfishing, destructive fishing practices, coastal development, warming water temperatures, and the direct physical destruction caused by territorial competition has placed these reefs under a level of stress that scientists who study them describe with a kind of quiet urgency. The most dramatic and well-documented case of direct reef destruction in recent history is the Chinese island building program in the Spratly Islands. When China began dredging and constructing artificial islands on 7 reef features starting around 2013 and 2014. The physical process involved pumping enormous quantities of sand and sediment from the seafloor and depositing it on top of living reef systems. The Centre for Strategic and International Studies, through its Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, used commercial satellite imagery to document the scale of what was happening. Their analysis indicated that at least 160 square kilometres of reef had been destroyed or severely damaged by the dredging operations. 160 square kilometres. To put that in some kind of physical context, that is roughly the size of the city of Washington, D.C., and it is not empty land that was destroyed. It was living reef, built up over thousands of years, home to fish, invertebrates, and the broader food chains that depend on healthy coral habitat. Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef are the 3 largest of the constructed islands, and all 3 were built on top of reef systems that had been intact. Mischief Reef in particular had been a low-tide elevation, essentially a submerged reef platform that barely broke the surface at low water. By 2016, it had become an island of several square kilometres with a runway, harbour facilities, and military installations. The reef it was built on no longer exists in any meaningful ecological sense. It was buried under concrete and fill. The fish and corals that depended on it had nowhere to go. This kind of large-scale physical destruction is the most visible part of the ecological story, but it is not the only part, and in some ways it is not even the most pervasive. The fishing practices that have been documented across the South China Sea for decades represent a slower but equally serious form of damage. Dynamite fishing, which involves detonating explosives in the water to stun or kill fish for easy collection, is illegal under the domestic law of every country in the region. It is also widely practiced. The explosions do not just kill the targeted fish, they shatter coral structure, killing the reef itself in the blast radius. A single dynamite fishing event can destroy years of coral growth in seconds. Repeated over time, across a reef system, the cumulative damage is enormous. Cyanide fishing is a related practice, used primarily to capture live fish for the aquarium trade and the live fish food market. Sodium cyanide solution is squirted directly onto reef structures to stun fish, which are then collected live. The cyanide kills the coral polyps it contacts and disrupts the broader reef chemistry. Fish caught this way often die within days or weeks of capture, which means large numbers are taken to compensate for the losses. The demand for live reef fish in restaurants across East and Southeast Asia, particularly for species like Napoleon wrasse and grouper, has driven cyanide fishing to a scale that would have been difficult to imagine 50 years ago. Then there is the matter of giant clam poaching, which became one of the more visible flashpoints in the ecological story of the South China Sea in the early 2010s. Giant clams, particularly the species Tridacna gigas, which can live for over 100 years and grow to more than a metre in length, had already been heavily depleted across the Indo-Pacific by decades of harvesting for their meat and shells. By the time large-scale poaching operations began to attract international attention in the South China Sea, wild populations in many areas were already severely reduced. Chinese fishing vessels were repeatedly documented and in some cases apprehended carrying thousands of giant clamshells. In April 2013, a Chinese fishing boat ran aground on Tubataha Reef, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Philippines, and was found to be carrying over 10,000 kilograms of pangolin meat and hundreds of giant clamshells. In 2014, Philippine Coast Guard officials intercepted a Chinese vessel near Half Moon Shoal in the Spratlys, carrying over 500 giant clams, some of them still alive. The poaching was not small-scale opportunism. It was organised and systematic, involving vessels that had clearly travelled specifically to collect the clams from reef areas that were technically under Philippine jurisdiction or in disputed waters where enforcement was difficult. Giant clams are not just a single species at risk. They play a functional role in reef ecosystems. They filter large volumes of water, improving water clarity and quality. Their shells provide habitat for smaller organisms. When they are removed at scale, the effects are felt across the reef community. The combination of their long lifespan and slow reproduction rate means that populations which have been heavily poached take decades to recover, if they recover at all. The fish stock collapse in the South China Sea is perhaps the most consequential ecological fact in the entire story of this disputed water, precisely because it is the one that most directly affects the lives of the hundreds of millions of people who depend on the sea for protein and income. Studies published in scientific journals, including Nature and Marine Policy, have documented declines in fish biomass across the South China Sea that range from severe to catastrophic, depending on the specific location and species examined. Some estimates suggest that overall fish stocks have declined by as much as 70 to 90% from their 1950s levels in certain heavily fished areas. The sea that was once extraordinarily productive has been fished down to a fraction of its historical abundance. This decline is not evenly distributed, and it is not entirely the result of any single country's fishing practices. Vietnam, the Philippines, China, Malaysia and Indonesia all have large fishing fleets operating in the South China Sea, and all of them have contributed to the depletion. But the scale of the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, which is the largest in the world by a significant margin, means that Chinese fishing activity has had an outsized impact. The Chinese government has also subsidized its fishing fleet heavily, providing fuel subsidies and vessel construction support that have allowed Chinese fishermen to operate in waters far from their home coast and to deploy fishing gear and methods that smaller, less subsidized fleets cannot match. There is a particular irony embedded in the ecological story of the South China Sea that is worth sitting with for a moment. The territorial disputes that have defined this sea for decades are, at their stated core, about resources. China's historical claims, Vietnam's insistence on its fishing rights, the Philippines' defence of its exclusive economic zone, Malaysia's interest in its offshore energy blocks, all of these are fundamentally about access to what the sea contains. The fish, the oil, the gas, the seabed minerals. The resources are the reason the flags are planted and the warships are deployed and the legal briefs are filed. And yet the manner in which the territorial competition has been conducted is actively destroying those resources. The artificial island construction has buried reef systems that supported fish populations that all of the competing nations' fishermen depend on. The presence of large military installations on previously uninhabited reefs has disrupted nesting sites for seabirds and resting areas for sea turtles. The escalating presence of Coast Guard and naval vessels has pushed fishing activity into areas that were previously less intensively fished, accelerating depletion in those zones. The political competition over who owns the sea is making the sea less worth owning. This is not a subtle or complicated observation, but it is one that is almost entirely absent from the diplomatic and political conversations about the South China Sea. The negotiations over a code of conduct between China and ASEAN, which have been ongoing for more than 2 decades, do not include binding environmental protection provisions. The arbitration case brought by the Philippines in 2013 did raise environmental issues, and the 2016 ruling did find that China had violated its obligations to protect the marine environment under UNCLOS, specifically in relation to the reef destruction and the facilitation of giant clam poaching. But since China refused to recognise the ruling, the environmental findings have had no practical enforcement effect. Coral reef ecologists who study the region have noted that some of the reefs in the Spratlys and Paracels are also experiencing the broader stresses of ocean warming and acidification that are affecting reef systems globally. Coral bleaching events, in which elevated water temperatures cause corals to expel the symbiotic algae that give them colour and nutrition, have been documented in the South China Sea. A reef system that is already physically damaged by dredging, chemically stressed by cyanide fishing, structurally weakened by dynamite blasts, and overfished to a fraction of its historical productivity is far less resilient when a bleaching event occurs. Resilience requires a healthy baseline. The baseline in many parts of the South China Sea has been severely degraded. There are places in the sea where the reefs remain in better condition, generally in areas that are more remote, less accessible, or that have benefited from some degree of protection. Tubataha Reef, the Philippine World Heritage Site where the Chinese fishing vessel ran aground in 2013, is one such place. It is located in the Sulu Sea at the southern edge of the broader South China Sea system, and its distance from the main shipping lanes and fishing grounds has helped preserve it. Scientists who dive there describe it as a glimpse of what the broader reef system once looked like: abundant, complex, alive in a way that the more heavily impacted reefs no longer are. That comparison is useful precisely because it makes visible what has been lost elsewhere. The ecological cost of the South China Sea dispute is not an abstract or secondary concern. It is real, measurable, and ongoing. It is also largely invisible in the political conversation, because the people who make decisions about territorial claims and military deployments are generally not the same people who are watching the fish stocks decline or measuring the extent of reef destruction. The fishermen who are most directly affected by the ecological collapse are also the people with the least political power in the entire situation. They are not at the negotiating tables. They are not consulted about the placement of military installations. They simply go to sea and find, year after year, that the catch is smaller, that they have to travel farther, that the reefs they have fished for generations look different than they did when their parents fished them. The sea that all of these nations are competing over so fiercely is, in a biological sense, becoming less and less of what they are competing for. And the damage being done now will not be reversed quickly. Coral reefs, even in the best conditions, grow slowly. A reef system that took thousands of years to develop cannot be rebuilt in a decade. Fish populations that have been reduced to a fraction of their historical abundance take generations to recover if the pressures on them are removed. The pressures have not been removed. They are in most parts of the South China Sea still increasing. All of this, the destroyed reefs, the depleted fish stocks, the poisoned water around dynamite blast sites, the buried coral under artificial islands, lands somewhere specific. It lands on people, not on governments or navies or legal briefs, but on individual human beings who wake up every morning and go out onto the water because that is how they feed their families and earn their living. The ecological losses of the South China Sea are not just an environmental story. They are a human story, and it is that human dimension, the fishermen and the sailors and the migrants, and the people whose ordinary lives are shaped by this extraordinary sea, that the story turns to next. The fishermen of the South China Sea do not appear in most of the headlines about it. They are not the ones making speeches at the United Nations or filing legal briefs at international tribunals or positioning warships near contested reefs. They are the ones who have always been there, who were there long before the dash lines were drawn and the artificial islands were built and the diplomatic cables were sent. They are the ones who know the water by feel, who can read the colour of the sea to estimate depth, who learned which currents run where and in what season, from their fathers and grandfathers who learned the same things from theirs. And in the last few decades, the world they inherited has become something quite different from the world their families fished for generations. The Vietnamese fishing community has been particularly exposed to the human cost of the territorial competition. Vietnam's coastline runs the entire western length of the South China Sea, and Vietnamese fishermen have worked these waters for centuries. The boats are often small, wooden, painted in bright colours, and equipped with little more than a radio and a basic navigation system. They go out for days or weeks at a time, and they fish in waters that China now claims as its own. Between 2010 and 2023, human rights organisations and Vietnamese government records documented more than 100 incidents in which Vietnamese fishing vessels were detained, boarded, or attacked by Chinese Coast Guard or maritime militia vessels. The boats were sometimes rammed, equipment was confiscated, catches were taken, in some cases, fishermen were beaten. In others, they were held for days before being released, sometimes without their vessels, which meant returning home with nothing and no way to go back out. These are not abstract statistics, they are individual stories. A fisherman from Quang Ngai province who has been fishing the Paracel since he was a teenager, whose boat was boarded 3 times in 5 years, who had his GPS equipment taken each time because the Chinese vessels did not want him to have precise records of where the encounter happened. A crew from Da Nang who were held for 11 days in 2019 before their families paid an informal fee to secure their release. Older fishermen who described the sea as fundamentally changed, not just in terms of the fish, but in terms of the fear. You used to go out and come back. One account put it simply. Now you go out and you do not always know what will happen. The situation at Scarborough Shoal has a particular history that is worth understanding in some detail. Scarborough Shoal is a triangular chain of reefs and rocks in the South China Sea, about 220 kilometres from the Philippine island of Luzon, and roughly 800 kilometres from the Chinese coast. Filipino fishermen had fished there for generations, as had some Vietnamese and Chinese fishermen. In April 2012, a Philippine naval vessel discovered several Chinese fishing boats inside the shoal and attempted to arrest the crews for illegal fishing. Chinese maritime surveillance ships arrived and blocked the arrest. A tense standoff followed for several weeks. Eventually, both the Philippines and China agreed to withdraw their vessels as part of a diplomatic arrangement mediated partly by the United States. The Philippines withdrew, China did not. Chinese vessels have controlled access to Scarborough Shoal ever since. Filipino fishermen who had fished those waters their entire lives were blocked from entering. For years after 2012, any Filipino boat that approached the shoal was turned away by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. The fishing grounds that those communities had depended on were simply closed to them, not by a law they had been consulted about, not by a treaty their government had agreed to, but by the physical presence of vessels large enough that a small wooden fishing boat had no practical recourse. There were periods, particularly around 2016 following the arbitration ruling and a brief diplomatic warming between Manila and Beijing, when Filipino fishermen were allowed back into parts of the shoal. But the access has been inconsistent and conditional, dependent on the state of political relations between the two governments, rather than on any legal right or stable agreement. The fishermen themselves have had no say in when they can fish and when they cannot. Their livelihoods have become a bargaining chip in a diplomatic relationship they are not part of. The 2014 standoff over the Chinese oil rig HD 981 is another moment that is often discussed in political terms but less often in human ones. In May 2014, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation deployed the Haiyang Xiu 981 drilling platform into waters that Vietnam considered part of its exclusive economic zone, about 120 nautical miles from the Vietnamese coast, and within the contested waters near the Paracel Islands. China positioned a large flotilla of vessels around the rig to protect it. Vietnam sent Coast Guard and fishing vessels to protest the rig's presence. What followed was weeks of confrontation at sea. Chinese vessels used water cannons against Vietnamese boats. Vietnamese vessels attempted to approach the rig and were blocked. On May 26, 2014, a Chinese vessel rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing boat, the DN 90152, near the rig. The 11 crew members were rescued, but the boat was lost. Over the course of the standoff, at least 21 Vietnamese vessels were rammed or damaged by Chinese ships. The rig was eventually withdrawn in July 2014, roughly a month ahead of schedule, but the episode left a lasting mark on Vietnamese public opinion and on the communities whose boats had been caught in the middle of it. On the Philippine side of the sea, the situation at 2nd Thomas Shoal has become one of the most persistently tense, ongoing confrontations in the region. Second Thomas Shoal is a submerged reef in the Spratly Islands, well within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone as defined by UNCLOS. Since 1999, the Philippines has maintained a small detachment of Marines aboard the BRP Sierra Madre, a deliberately grounded and rusting World War II-era ship, as a physical assertion of its claim. The Marines stationed there live in extremely difficult conditions. The ship is corroding, the heat is intense. Supplies have to be brought in by small boats from the Philippine coast, a journey that can take many hours. The resupply missions have become a recurring flashpoint. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have repeatedly attempted to block or intercept Philippine supply boats, using water cannons, flares, and physical obstruction. In August 2023, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel fired a military-grade laser at a Philippine Coast Guard ship during a resupply mission, temporarily blinding some of the crew members. In early 2024, Chinese vessels used water cannons to prevent the delivery of supplies to the Sierra Madre on multiple occasions, damaging the Philippine boats and injuring crew members. The Marines on the ship watched the confrontations from the deck, waiting for the supplies that might or might not get through. The South China Sea has also been a route for human migration, and not always voluntary or safe migration. The most historically significant episode was the exodus of Vietnamese refugees in the late 1970s and 1980s, a period during which hundreds of thousands of people fled Vietnam by boat following the end of the Vietnam War and the political and economic upheaval that followed. These were the people who became known as the Vietnamese boat people, and their journeys across the South China Sea were among the most dangerous mass migrations of the 20th century. The boats were overcrowded, often barely seaworthy. The sea did not care. Storms sank vessels. People died of dehydration. And in what became one of the most documented horrors of the period, pirates operating in the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea attacked refugee boats repeatedly and with extraordinary brutality. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that by 1979, pirates were attacking roughly 80% of refugee boats passing through certain areas. Women were abducted. People were murdered. Boats were sunk. The Thai pirates who carried out many of these attacks did so with near impunity for years before international pressure eventually led to some enforcement efforts. The total death toll from the Vietnamese boat people crisis is not precisely known, but estimates range from 200,000 to 400,000 people who died at sea. It is one of the largest maritime humanitarian disasters of the modern era, and it unfolded on the same waters that are now contested by navies and coast guards and legal claims. Irregular migration continues in the South China Sea today, though the patterns and nationalities involved have shifted. People from various parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia use the sea as a migration route, often in dangerous and overcrowded vessels, seeking work or refuge in countries with stronger economies or greater political stability. The sea does not distinguish between a naval vessel and a refugee boat. The typhoons and the currents and the reefs are equally indifferent to everyone. There is something worth sitting with for a moment in all of this. The people most directly harmed by the conditions in the South China Sea are almost never the people with any power over those conditions. The Vietnamese fisherman whose boat was rammed near the Paracels did not decide where China would place its oil rig. The Filipino Marines on the corroding Sierra Madre did not design their country's foreign policy. The refugee families who crossed this sea in the 1970s and 1980s were not consulted about the political arrangements that had made their homeland unlivable. The fishermen of Scarborough Shoal did not negotiate the terms of the 2012 standoff. They simply arrived at the shoal one morning and found that they were no longer allowed to be there. This gap between the people who make decisions about the sea and the people who live with the consequences of those decisions is not unique to the South China Sea. It is a feature of most large geopolitical disputes. But it is particularly visible here because the sea is so immediately physical, so directly tied to daily life, and because the communities that depend on it are so clearly distinct from the governments that claim it. When a minister in Beijing or Manila or Hanoi makes a statement about territorial rights or maritime sovereignty, the language is abstract, legalistic, strategic. When a fisherman from a coastal village in central Vietnam loses his boat and his catch and spends 11 days in detention before being released, the language is different. It is the language of a family without income, of a boat that needs to be replaced, of a fishing ground that is no longer safe to visit. The human cost is also not evenly distributed. Larger vessels, better equipped boats, fishermen with connections to government protection programs, or those who fish in less contested waters face different risks than small-scale fishermen working in wooden boats in the most disputed zones. The people most exposed are often the poorest, the ones who cannot afford to fish elsewhere, who do not have the equipment to go farther out or the political connections to navigate the bureaucratic systems that might offer some protection. They are the ones who bear the sharpest edge of a dispute they did not create. It is worth noting that ordinary Chinese fishermen are also part of this picture, though their relationship to the Chinese state's maritime activities is more complicated. Some of the fishing vessels operating in the South China Sea under Chinese flag are part of what analysts describe as a maritime militia, a loosely organised force of fishing boats that operate under some degree of coordination with the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy, used to assert presence in contested areas without deploying formal military vessels. But many Chinese fishermen are simply fishermen, going out to sea to make a living, operating in waters their government tells them are Chinese territory. They too face the physical dangers of the sea. They too are shaped by decisions made above them. The South China Sea, at its most human level, is a working sea. It has always been a working sea. Long before the dash lines and the arbitration cases and the satellite imagery and the military installations, it was a place where people went to fish and to trade and to travel, where communities on its shores measured their lives by its seasons and its moods. The political competition that has transformed it in the last few decades has not erased that human reality. It has just made it harder and more dangerous and more precarious for the people who live it every day. All of these human stories, the detained fishermen, the blocked resupply missions, the corroding ship with its small marine detachment, the refugees who crossed these waters in the dark, the ordinary lives interrupted and sometimes ended by a dispute that has no resolution in sight, are part of what makes the South China Sea more than a geopolitical problem. They are the reason the question of what happens next, of where this dispute is heading and what a resolution might look like, and what the cost of continued conflict will be, is not just a strategic question, it is a deeply human one. And it is that question, the question of the future, that the story arrives at now. So where does it stand right now, in the middle of this decade, with all of that history and all of those human lives behind it? The honest answer is that it stands roughly where it has been standing for years, which is to say in a kind of sustained, low-grade crisis that has not broken into open war but has not moved meaningfully toward resolution either. As of 2024, the flashpoint that draws the most consistent attention is Second Thomas Shoal, a small submerged reef in the Spratly Islands where the Philippines has kept its deliberately grounded warship, the BRP Sierra Madre, since 1999. The small detachment of Filipino Marines living on that rusting vessel has become, in a quiet and uncomfortable way, one of the most symbolically loaded military positions in the world. China has repeatedly tried to prevent Philippine resupply missions from reaching the ship, using water cannons, laser devices, and physical blocking maneuvers. The Philippines has continued sending boats. The standoff has escalated and de-escalated and escalated again in a rhythm that has become almost predictable, and yet each new incident carries the possibility of going further than the last. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the regional bloc that includes most of the South China Sea's coastal states, has been trying to negotiate a binding code of conduct with China for more than 2 decades. 2 decades. The talks have produced draft frameworks, consultations, working groups, and carefully worded joint statements. What they have not produced is a binding agreement. The reasons are not hard to understand. China has preferred to negotiate bilaterally with individual claimant states rather than collectively through ASEAN, which dilutes the bloc's leverage. Some ASEAN members, particularly Cambodia and Laos, have historically been reluctant to take positions that would antagonise Beijing. And the fundamental disagreement about what a code of conduct should actually say, whether it should have legal force, whether it should cover the artificial islands China has already built, whether it should restrict military activities, has proven impossible to bridge. The negotiation has continued long enough that it has become, in some ways, a substitute for resolution rather than a path toward it. As long as talks are ongoing, no one has to admit that the talks are not working. China's island building program has not reversed. The military installations on Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef are now well established, equipped with runways capable of handling military aircraft, hardened hangars, radar systems, and surface-to-air missile batteries. The physical transformation of those reefs from low-lying coral formations to functioning military outposts is complete. It happened relatively quickly between roughly 2013 and 2016, and the international response, while vocal, did not stop it. The Permanent Court of Arbitration's 2016 ruling, which found China's historical rights claims legally invalid, was simply not recognised by China. It was a legal document issued into a political vacuum. The ruling still exists, the Philippines still cites it, and China still declines to engage with it. That gap between what international law says and what actually happens on the water is one of the defining features of the South China Sea dispute, and it does not appear to be closing. There is a new variable in this picture that was not part of the conversation a generation ago, and it adds a layer of complication that no one has fully worked out yet. Climate change is altering sea levels, and rising sea levels have a direct legal consequence in the South China Sea. Under UNCLOS, the maritime entitlements of an island or feature depend partly on its physical characteristics, specifically whether it remains above water at high tide, whether it can sustain human habitation, and whether it qualifies as a full island or only a rock or a low tide elevation. If sea levels rise enough to submerge features that currently sit just above the waterline, those features lose their legal status as islands, and with them their associated maritime zones. Some of the features currently claimed and occupied in the Spratlys are barely above the water now. The legal implications of their potential submersion are genuinely unresolved, and no one is eager to have that conversation, because it would require acknowledging that the very geography being fought over is not permanent. The possibility of miscalculation is something analysts return to again and again, and it is worth taking seriously. The South China Sea is a crowded space. It has Chinese Coast Guard vessels and naval ships, Philippine Coast Guard vessels and fishing boats, Vietnamese fishing fleets, American carrier strike groups and surveillance aircraft, Australian and British naval vessels conducting freedom of navigation transits, and the ordinary commercial traffic of dozens of nations moving through on its shipping lanes. All of these actors are operating in relatively close proximity, under different rules of engagement, with different communication protocols, and with different domestic political pressures pushing them toward firmness. An incident that begins as a water cannon deployment, or a vessel collision, or a confrontation over a resupply mission could escalate in ways that are not intended and not easily reversed. The history of military confrontations is full of moments when no one wanted a war, and a war happened anyway, because the mechanisms for de-escalation were not fast enough, or the domestic political cost of backing down was too high, or a single decision made under pressure turned out to have consequences no one had fully anticipated. What would a genuine diplomatic resolution require? It is worth thinking about this carefully, not because resolution seems imminent, but because understanding what it would take helps clarify why it has not happened. A meaningful resolution would require China to accept some meaningful constraint on its behaviour in the sea, which means accepting a legal framework it has spent years rejecting. It would require the other claimant states to accept arrangements that may give them less than they believe they are entitled to under international law. It would require the United States to find a way to remain engaged in the region without its presence being used by any party as a reason to avoid compromise. It would require ASEAN to function as a more coherent collective actor than it has historically managed to be. And it would require all of these things to happen in a political environment where nationalism is a powerful force in almost every country involved, where leaders who make concessions on territorial issues face real domestic costs, and where the economic stakes are large enough that no one wants to be the party that gave something up. None of this is impossible, but none of it is easy either, and none of it appears to be close. There are quieter possibilities that sometimes get discussed. Functional arrangements rather than formal resolutions, agreements on fishing access or resource development that do not require anyone to formally concede a territorial claim, joint development zones where the legal ownership question is set aside in favour of shared economic benefit. These kinds of arrangements have been explored in other maritime disputes. The Timor Sea Treaty between Australia and Timor-Leste involved decades of negotiation over resource rights, before a permanent maritime boundary was finally settled in 2018. The North Sea oil and gas fields were developed through cooperative agreements among European states with overlapping claims. It is not impossible to imagine something similar in the South China Sea. But the political dynamics here are more complex, the number of parties is larger, and the strategic dimension, the military installations, the great power competition, the alliance commitments, the question of American credibility in Asia adds a layer that makes purely functional arrangements harder to sustain. And underneath all of this, the sea itself continues. That is perhaps the thing that is easiest to lose sight of in a conversation about legal rulings and military installations and diplomatic frameworks. The South China Sea is not a political concept. It is a physical place. It is 3.5 million square kilometres of water that has been moving and shifting and deepening and warming for tens of millions of years. Its coral reefs were growing before there were human beings to argue about them. Its typhoons were forming over its warm, shallow water long before anyone drew a line on a map. The fish that swim through the Spratlys do not know about the 9-dash line. The currents that run through the Luzon Strait do not pause for diplomatic negotiations. The sea has watched a great deal of human activity across its surface. Chinese junks trading between ports, Vietnamese fishing boats working the reefs, Spanish galleons carrying silver from Manila, Japanese warships during the Second World War, American aircraft carriers in the decades since, and now dredging machines building islands that did not exist before, Coast Guard ships firing water cannons at resupply boats, satellites photographing every change in the landscape from orbit. The sea has held all of this, absorbed all of it, continued regardless. It is not indifferent in any emotional sense, because the sea has no emotions, but it is indifferent in a physical sense. It will be here long after the current disputes have been resolved, or have transformed into something unrecognisable, long after the political arrangements of this era have shifted in ways no one can predict. There is something quietly clarifying about that thought, if you let it settle. The arguments being made over this sea, the historical claims going back to the Han Dynasty, the legal briefs filed in The Hague, the satellite imagery showing new runways on reclaimed reefs, the water cannons and the resupply missions and the diplomatic communiques. All of it is happening on a geological and ecological timescale that dwarfs the political one. The West Philippine Deep reaches 5,559 metres below the surface. The Sunda Shelf has been shaping the sea's floor for 32 million years. The coral reefs in the Coral Triangle contain species that evolved over millions of years of geological change. Against that scale, the disputes of the last few decades are very recent, and the disputes of the next few decades will also pass. That is not a reason for indifference to what happens. The human costs are real and immediate. The fishermen who cannot access their traditional grounds, the marines on a rusting ship, the reef ecosystems destroyed by dredging, the families who crossed this sea as refugees and did not survive it, None of that becomes less important because the sea is old and the disputes are recent. If anything, the contrast makes the waste of it more apparent. A sea of this age and richness and complexity, a sea that sustains hundreds of millions of people and carries a third of the world's trade and holds one of the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on the planet, deserves better than to be the stage for an unresolved territorial competition that has already cost it 160 square kilometres of reef and is not finished taking. But the sea does not need our permission to continue. It will move through its seasons regardless. The typhoons will form in the warm water and track northward. The fish will move through the reefs and the open water, fewer of them now than there were, but still present, still cycling through the food web that has sustained coastal communities for centuries. The tides will rise and fall over the contested shoals. The deep basins will hold their silence. And somewhere on the surface the arguments will continue, the ships will move, and the people who live their lives closest to the water will keep doing what they have always done, which is navigate the best they can with the sea they have. The South China Sea will not be resolved quickly. That seems clear enough. But it will not stay exactly as it is either, because nothing does. The pressures are too many and too varied for the current state of managed tension to hold indefinitely. Something will shift, whether through diplomacy or accident or the slow weight of environmental change, or the gradual realignment of economic and political interests that no one can fully anticipate from here. What that shift will look like, whether it will be toward greater stability or toward something more dangerous, is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is probably the most honest thing that can be said about where the South China Sea stands tonight. It is a place of extraordinary depth and age, a place that has been travelled and fought over and fished and navigated for as long as human beings have lived on its shores, a place that holds within it some of the most complex ecological systems on the planet and some of the most intractable political disputes of our era. A place where the stakes are high enough that the people with power over it cannot afford to walk away, and where the people without power over it cannot afford to ignore it. If you have travelled all this way through this story, through the geology and the history and the legal arguments and the island building and the fishermen and the refugees and the corroding warship on its reef, then you have some sense now of what makes this sea what it is. Not just dangerous in the headlines and military hardware sense, though, it is that. But layered and old and genuinely consequential in ways that connect to the daily lives of more people than most of us ever stop to consider. The sea goes on. Somewhere out there right now in the dark, a fishing boat is moving across water that 4 or 5 governments claim as their own. The fisherman at the wheel probably knows the reefs better than any diplomat does. He knows which shoal to avoid at low tide, which current to use, which way the weather is turning. He's been making these calculations his whole life, and tonight, like every night, he is just trying to get home. Sleep well, wherever you are. The water is deep and the story is long and there is still so much we do not know.